Hello friends, about of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. I'm Mark, and I used to be a ranger up in the Angeles National Forest. Spent 6 years there, believe it or not. It's kind of funny, because I swore I'd be an office guy forever, stuck behind a computer, pretending to give a damn about firewalls and startups. Yeah, that was the plan. Until the wife, Sarah, and I split. That whole mess just broke me, I guess. Needed to get away from everything, the city, the noise, the whole life I'd screwed up. The forest seemed like the perfect hideout. But here's the thing about being alone in the woods. It's not always peaceful. Sometimes that quiet feels wrong. Like you're alone because something out there wants it that way. So, it was back in 2004. This particular day was weird from the get-go. The forest was dead quiet. Like, too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Even the usual weekend warriors, hikers, campers, drunk teenagers were gone. Vanished. My job that day was to check on some campers who'd set up way off the beaten path. I mean, way out there. I'm not usually one to complain, but the whole thing felt off. I hopped out of my truck, grabbed my radio, which, spoiler alert, was useless later, and started down the trail. It was a good 3-mile hike to their campsite. Normally, I'd enjoy it. Maybe crack a few jokes to myself, keep things light. But this day the silence was heavy, like a wet blanket. I finally got to the campsite and nothing. Tents were still there, fire pit, some clothes hanging up to dry, but no people. That's never a good sign. I walked around, yelled out their names. A guy named Alex and a couple of girls, I think, Lisa and Chloe. No answer. The only weird thing was a deck of cards scattered near one of the tents, like they were playing a game and just stopped. No blood, no sign of a struggle, zip. They were just gone. Now, campers wander off all the time, but usually they take their stuff. These guys left everything, backpacks, food, everything. It was like they stood up and walked away mid-sentence. I radioed it in, asked if anyone had seen them back on the main trail or in town. Nope. Dispatch hadn't heard from them either. I poked around for a while, looking for clues. About 50 yards from the campsite, I found something that made my gut clench. The ground was all messed up, like something heavy had been dragged through there, and the tracks, oh man, the tracks. They were huge, wide, deep, but not human, and not like any animal I'd ever seen. I thought about taking a picture, but my crappy old film camera was useless in the dim light under those trees. Here's where I messed up, first time anyway. I decided to follow those tracks. Just for a bit, I told myself. See where they went. Yeah, right. Those tracks led me deeper into the woods than I'd ever been. It was darker, colder. The trees were all twisted and messed up. The air was thick, damp, like nobody had been there in a century. I kept going, and the tracks started getting harder to follow, looping back on themselves, like whatever I was following knew I was there and was messing with me. After about an hour, I found something that made me want to puke. A boot, just one, half buried in the dirt. It was muddy, but I knew it was one of the campers, Alex's, I think. Not good. Not good at all. Then I heard it, a sound in the distance. Faint, but definitely something moving. Fast. At first, I thought maybe it was the campers, lost, trying to find their way back. But the longer I listened, the more wrong it sounded. The movement was weird, jerky, fast, then slow, then fast again. No animal I knew moved like that. I tried the radio again. Static, of course. And then I saw something. Big. just at the edge of my vision, moving between the trees. I couldn't make it out, but it was way bigger than any deer or bear. My gut screamed at me to turn back, to get the hell out of there, but I had to know what happened to those campers. I stayed low, moved as quietly as I could, following the sound. It led me to a small clearing, a little patch of sunlight. And there it was. At first, I thought it was a fallen tree or something. Then I got closer. It was a body. No bodies. Plural. They were ripped apart. Limbs torn off, bones shattered. I almost threw up, but I held it together. At least 3 of them, the campers, I guessed. But what could have done that? As I'm standing there, staring at this nightmare, I heard that sound again. That jerky, fast movement, closer this time. Way closer. I spun around, heart pounding like a drum solo, and then I saw it. It stepped into the clearing, partly hidden by the trees, but I saw enough. It wasn't natural. It was tall, 7 feet, maybe taller. Its skin was pale, like sickly white, as if it had never seen the sun. It walked on 2 legs, but the way it moved was wrong. Jerky, like it wasn't used to it. The body was humanoid but stretched out, too thin in some places, too bulky in others. And the smell, God, the smell, like rotting meat, days old. It didn't make a sound, just stared at me, head cocked to the side, like it was curious. My brain finally kicked in, and I ran. Running in the forest is a terrible idea, but I didn't care. I just ran. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the trees, way faster than something that big should be able to move. I knew I wasn't going to make it. This thing was going to catch me, tear me apart like those campers, and nobody would ever find me. But then, through the trees, I saw it a ranger station. I hadn't even realized I was that close to one. I sprinted, legs burning, lungs on fire. I made it inside, slammed the door, locked it. I could hear it outside, scratching at the walls, pushing against the door. It was heavy, testing the place, looking for a way in. I grabbed the radio, tried to get through to anyone. Static, always static. The thing slammed against the door, hard enough to splinter the wood. I grabbed a flare gun off the wall. Not much, but it was something. If it came through that door, I was going to light it up. I didn't have to wait long. The door exploded inward, and there it was, standing in the doorway. I fired the flare gun, hit it right in the chest. The thing screamed, a high-pitched sound like nails on a chalkboard, but 1,000 times worse. It stumbled back, the flare burning through its skin, but it didn't stop. It kept coming, slower now, but still coming. I fired again, but the gun was empty. I was done. The thing lunged at me, claws outstretched. But then, something weird happened. It stopped, just froze, mid-air, like something had grabbed it. Its body twitched, spasmed, and then it just collapsed, fell to the floor. I stood there, gasping, trying to understand what just happened. The thing was dead, or at least not moving. I didn't waste any time. I ran out of that station and headed straight for the main road. Got a signal on the radio, called it in. A team went out, found the campers, what was left of them. But when they got to the station, the thing I'd killed, I guess, was gone. The official report said it was a bear attack. I didn't argue. Nobody would believe me anyway. The next day, I packed my stuff and left the Angeles National Forest for good. Whatever that thing was, I never wanted to see it again. And sometimes when it's real quiet, I think it's still out there, waiting. It was 2004, and I found myself smack dab in the middle of nowhere, the Bloodwood National Forest in Pennsylvania. My name's Alex Ramsey, and if there's one thing I'm champion at, it's finding myself in the worst place at the worst possible time. You'd think growing up in Pittsburgh with 3 older brothers, I'd have learned a thing or two about staying out of trouble. Nope. Here I was, lost in the woods, all for some peace and quiet. Go figure. The whole hiking trip wasn't even my idea. My buddy, Jake Collins, dragged me along. Jake's the kind of guy who thinks every camping trip should be a full-blown survival test. Forget a cozy cabin or a campground with, actual bathrooms. We had to hike 3 hours into the boonies, where the trees were so thick they could swallow you whole, and the air was so muggy it felt like trying to breathe through a wet rag. I should have just stayed home. Jake and I weren't alone, though. His brother-in-law, Ben, was with us, a guy I barely knew and who, as far as I could tell, hadn't said more than 5 words to me the whole drive up. The strong, silent type. So, you had Jake, all gung-ho about roughing it, and Ben, quiet as a mouse, and then there was me, feeling like the third wheel as usual. We set up camp on the second day, miles away from anything resembling civilization. That's when things started getting weird. Jake, of course, was totally clueless. He was too busy showing off his new hatchet and starting a fire like he was auditioning for Survivor. Ben just sat by the fire, staring into it like he was watching a movie no one else could see. I kept myself busy pitching the tent, but I started hearing this rustling sound beyond the trees. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind or a squirrel, but it didn't sound quite right. It was like something was pacing out there, moving in and out of the shadows, seeing how close it could get without us noticing. Jake was the first to say something. He was all, "It's probably just a couple of raccoons. Just keep your food wrapped up, and they'll leave us alone." Ben didn't say anything. He just kept staring at the fire, his jaw clenched tight. By the third night, things were seriously tense. I hadn't slept well since we got there. I felt like we were being watched. You know that feeling when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up? I had that all night long. Maybe it was intuition, or maybe I was just being paranoid. We were sitting around the fire when we heard it again, louder this time, closer. The sound of something big moving through the underbrush. Too heavy to be a deer, too deliberate to be a bear. And then the smell hit us. It was rank, like roadkill that had been baking in the sun for days. Even Jake noticed it this time. He grabbed his hatchet like that was going to do anything against whatever was out there. Ben still didn't move. He just stared at the fire like he was expecting this. I mumbled something about going to check it out because, of course, I'd be the one to do it. I don't own a gun because my ex-wife, Sarah, decided I shouldn't be trusted with one after I nearly shot our kitchen window during a home intruder drill I set up. Long story. So, I stepped out past the edge of our camp, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a tent stake. The flashlight didn't do much except light up branches and a wall of darkness. I didn't get far before I saw something I still can't explain. It was crouched low, blending into the shadows. It was the size of a man, but twisted and hunched over, covered in this coarse, matted fur. Its arms and legs were all wrong, too long and thin, with joints that bent in ways they shouldn't. And its face, if you could call it that, it was more like a snout, long and almost dog-like, with sharp features and a stench that made me want to puke. I froze. Whatever it was, it saw me too. It lifted its head in this jerky, unnatural way, and I swear I could feel its eyes lock onto me. My mind went blank. I started backing up, my heart hammering in my chest. The thing stood up on 2 legs, towering over the underbrush. It moved toward me, slow at first, like it was sizing me up. The tent stake in my hand suddenly felt very, very small. I managed to yell for Jake and Ben, hoping they'd have a better plan than run. Jake came charging out of the camp, hatchet raised, while Ben, in his usual style, stayed near the fire, his eyes fixed on the trees like he knew what was coming. Jake screamed something, probably trying to scare the thing off. It didn't work. The creature lunged forward, incredibly fast, and knocked Jake off his feet like he was a rag doll. I can't explain what I saw next without sounding crazy. The thing, it ripped into Jake. It was fast, brutal, and there was nothing I could do. Jake let out a sound, a scream. I'll never forget. Then there was just this awful ripping noise. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, watching it all happen. Ben hadn't moved an inch. He just stared at the fire like this was all normal. I wanted to scream, to do something, but I couldn't move. My mind was racing, but my body was paralyzed. The creature, apparently done with Jake, turned its head toward me again. This time, I didn't freeze. My legs started moving before my brain even caught up, and I was running back toward camp, screaming Ben's name, even though I knew it was probably pointless. There was no way we were getting out of this alive. I made it back to the fire, gasping for breath. My mind a total mess. Ben still hadn't moved. He finally spoke, though. "It's been here before," he said, his voice calm, too calm. "You should have stayed in the tent." I couldn't even process what he was saying. The creature hadn't followed me, at least not right away. Instead, it seemed to be circling us, moving just beyond the firelight. I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon, but all I had was that stupid tent stake. Ben finally stood up, calm as you please, and walked toward the edge of the firelight. He didn't seem scared. That's when I realized he knew more than he was saying. Before I could ask him what the hell was going on, he spoke again, his voice eerily calm. "This place, it calls to them," he said. "It's why I come here, to see how far it'll go." I thought he was insane. Who says something like that in the middle of all this? But the way he said it, it didn't sound crazy. It sounded resigned. And then it came back. This time, the thing wasn't alone. There were 2, maybe 3 of them, moving through the trees with that same unnatural speed. My stomach dropped. We were surrounded. Jake had been a warning, a test to see how we would react. Now it was playtime. Ben stepped forward as if to meet them. I was too stunned to stop him. He looked at me over his shoulder, a weird, grim smile on his face. "You should run, Alex," he said. "You've got no part in this." He didn't need to tell me twice. I ran. I didn't stop running until I couldn't hear the sounds of the forest anymore, until the stench of death wasn't choking. I don't know how I made it back to the trail, but I did. I was found the next morning by some hikers, half out of my mind, covered in sweat and blood. When the authorities found what was left of Jake, and that Ben was nowhere to be found, they had to admit something terrible had happened. They didn't ask me too many questions after that, probably because they didn't want to know. I never went back to the Bloodwood Forest. I hear about people going missing there sometimes, but I keep my distance. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just hunting us. It was waiting for something. As for Ben, I have no idea what happened to him. Part of me wonders if he's still out there, walking the woods with those things like their old friend. But hey, at least I got out alive. That's more than I can say for Jake. And next time someone asks me to go camping, I'll tell them I'm more of a hotel by the beach kind of guy. Trust me, you don't want to be stuck in those woods after dark. Not with things like that prowling around. Around here, people always told me, being a small-town cop must be a quiet job, huh? Well, that's what I thought too, until 2004, when I got stationed in Clearfield, Pennsylvania. Small town, not much going on, or so I thought. My name's Mark Reynolds, and back then, I was the kind of guy who believed I could handle just about anything. After all, what's the worst thing you're going to deal with in a town of 0 people? A few drunken bar fights? Maybe an occasional break-in? I thought I had it all figured out. But then came the weirdest night of my life, and it changed everything. Clearfield was quiet on most days, which left plenty of time for me to get to know the locals. You'd get the usual call someone lost their dog, or maybe old Mrs. Henderson claimed her neighbor was stealing tomatoes from her garden. But there was something about the woods that bordered the town, something that didn't sit right with me. I was never a superstitious guy, but the locals had these stories they whispered about people disappearing in the woods. Now, I wasn't one to believe in the boogeyman or anything like that. I'm the type of guy who needs facts, not some late-night ghost stories told over campfires. One night, I got a call about a missing person. At first, it seemed routine. Missing hiker probably wandered off one of the trails and got lost. Happens more than you'd think. But something felt off. The man who reported it, Ethan Miller, wasn't your typical concerned neighbor. He was panicked, frantic even. Said his brother, Sam, went out for a quick hike and hadn't come back. He never does this, Mark. Never, Ethan insisted. His eyes were wide, unblinking. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, but no gun. Our department had a no unnecessary force policy, which, at the time, seemed like a reasonable rule for a town like Clearfield. But looking back, maybe I should have grabbed something more than a flashlight. I headed to the trailhead where Sam was last seen. I met Ethan there, and his anxiety was enough to make me uneasy. We set off into the woods, and within minutes, the normal sounds of the forest crickets, rustling leaves all just stopped. You ever been in the woods when it's too quiet? Yeah, that's what it was. I made some stupid joke about Ethan being jumpy. Something about maybe Sam just ran into a bear and was hiding up a tree, which was my way of trying to lighten the mood. Ethan didn't laugh. We kept walking, deeper into the woods, and then we found something. It wasn't Sam, but his backpack torn, with its contents scattered across the ground, like some animal had gone through. I've seen raccoons make a mess of camping gear before, but this was different. The straps weren't just ripped. They were shredded, like something had deliberately torn it apart. My stomach turned, but I played it cool. Looks like maybe a coyote got to his stuff, I said, more to calm myself than Ethan. But he wasn't buying it. Mark, this ain't right, man. This ain't right. We kept going, and then, about 50 yards ahead, we saw a body. At least, what was left of one. I've seen bodies before natural causes, accidents, but nothing like this. The torso was mangled, torn open like a butcher's slab, and parts were missing. No human could have done that. No animal either, at least not any I knew of. It was pure carnage. And then it hit me, that smell. Rancid, coppery, and overwhelming. The kind of smell that sticks to the back of your throat and stays there, no matter how much you try to get rid of it. Ethan threw up right there. I can't blame him. I wanted to do the same. Mark, we gotta go, he muttered between heaves. We gotta call this in. I nodded, trying to stay calm, but my heart was pounding. I reached for my radio, but before I could even get a signal out, something moved, a low, deliberate rustling in the brush just beyond the tree line. My grip tightened on the flashlight. I felt exposed, like whatever was out there, whatever had done this, was watching us. Then I saw it. It was hard to make out at first, just a shape in the shadows. But as it moved closer, the details became clearer. It was big, bigger than any animal I'd ever seen. At first glance, it looked like a wolf, but its proportions were all wrong. The legs were too long, its back too hunched, and the claws, God, those claws, they were like sickles, gleaming in the pale light of the moon. Its skin, or what was left of it, hung in strips, like it had been skinned alive but was still moving, still hunting. Mark, Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. I didn't answer. It moved towards us, slow and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. This wasn't a bear or a wolf. This was something else, Something that didn't belong in those woods or anywhere. I backed up, pulling Ethan with me. We need to move. Now. We turned and ran. I don't remember much about the sprint back, just the sound of our feet pounding against the forest floor and the occasional snap of branches behind us. That thing, whatever it was following us. I could hear it, pacing us, like it was playing a game. We reached the trailhead, breathless and drenched in sweat. I fumbled for my radio, finally managing to call it in. Reinforcements were on their way, but it would be a while before they arrived. Ethan was a wreck, pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. I wanted to reassure him, but how could I? What the hell had we just seen? The next few hours were a blur. More officers arrived, along with some state troopers. We combed the area, but Sam's body was gone along with the creature. All we found was blood, a lot of it, staining the ground where his body had been. They brought in cadaver dogs, but they couldn't pick up a trail. It was like Sam had never been there. The official report, animal attack. That's what they chalked it up to. But I knew better. I saw the look in those troopers' eyes. They knew something wasn't right. But what could they do? Admit there was something out there, killing people? For weeks after Ethan stopped coming into town, I heard he moved away, couldn't take it anymore. I stayed, though. What else was I going to do? Tell people about the monster in the woods? Yeah, that'd go over well. It wasn't until about a month later that I saw it again. I was out on a late patrol, driving along the back roads near the forest. That's when I caught a glimpse of something moving along the tree line. It was quick, just a flash of that twisted, mangled form, but I knew it was the same thing. I stopped the car, got out, and stared into the dark, but it was gone. I didn't chase it. I wasn't stupid. People keep asking me why I don't hike anymore, why I avoid the woods. I usually just tell them I'm too busy with work. Easier that way. But the truth, I'm not going back in. Not after what I saw. Some things are better left alone. And that thing, it's still out there somewhere, waiting. But not for me. Not anymore. I never figured I'd end up smack dab in the middle of the Siberian wilderness. But there I was in 2019, trudging through knee-deep snow. Name's Finn O'Malley, and I've spent most of my life as a Green Beret. Growing up in a tiny Irish village, I always craved adventure beyond those rolling green hills and stone cottages. Joining the military seemed like the golden ticket out. Our mission was pretty straightforward. Find and get a missing biologist, Dr. Anya Volkov, who'd been studying some rare wolf packs in this godforsaken part of Russia. She'd gone radio silent for 2 weeks, and intel suggested she might have stumbled onto something classified. We were a 5-man team, each with our own specialty. There was Jax, our medic, solid guy, always prepared. Mateo, the comms guy, tech whiz. Ravi, demolitions, knew his way around explosives. Noah, our scout, sharp eyes, instincts like a wild animal. The chopper couldn't take us all the way in because of a sudden blizzard, so we had to hoof it the last 10 miles to the research station. The cold was brutal, and the wind howled like a banshee. Mateo tried to lighten the mood with a joke about us being human popsicles, but it bombed. Humor wasn't exactly his forte. As we got closer to the outpost, something felt off. The place was eerily quiet. None of the usual sounds you'd expect from a research station. No humming generators, no barking sled dogs, nothing. Noah raised a fist, signaling us to halt. He pointed at some tracks in the snow, deep, erratic footprints leading away from the facility and into the dense forest. We moved in cautiously. The front door was hanging open, barely on one hinge. Inside, the place was a wreck. Equipment smashed, papers scattered everywhere, and there was this weird metallic smell in the air. Jax pointed out a dark stain on the floor. Blood. A lot of it. Looks like someone had a really bad day, he muttered. Mateo tried the radios, but all frequencies were dead. I've got nothing. It's like we're in a total dead zone. We split up to search the place. In one of the labs, I found Dr. Volkoff's journal. Her last entries were frantic, talking about sightings of some unknown creature. She described it as massive, with the agility of a cat but the size of a bear. She thought it was a new species, maybe some kind of genetic mutation. I showed the journal to the others. So, we're dealing with Bigfoot now? Jack scoffed. Whatever it is, it tore this place apart, I replied. Noah came back from his sweep, looking pale. You guys need to see this, he said. He led us to a storage room. Inside were the remains of 2 researchers. Their bodies were mutilated is the only word for it. Limbs twisted at unnatural angles, deep gashes across their torsos, like they'd been clawed by something incredibly strong. Jax knelt beside them. These aren't just wounds, it's like something tried to rip them apart. Mateo swallowed hard. Maybe it was a bear. Those aren't bear marks, Noah said firmly. I've tracked bears before. This is different. We decided to follow the footprints leading into the forest, hoping to find any survivors. The tracks were bizarre, sometimes bipedal, other times like whatever made them drop to all 4. As we went deeper, the trees seemed to close in on us. The canopy blocked out what little sunlight there was, casting everything in a dim gray light. The silence was oppressive. Then, we found the first trap. Ravi nearly stepped into a camouflaged pit lined with sharpened stakes. What the hell? He exclaimed. Who sets traps out here? Jax wondered aloud. Someone who doesn't want to be followed, I said. We carefully got around the trap and pressed on. The footprints continued, but now there were signs of a struggle, broken branches, disturbed snow, drops of blood. A few hundred yards ahead, we stumbled upon a clearing. In the center was a makeshift structure, like a crude shelter made of branches and animal hide. Scattered around were more bodies, but these weren't just human. There were animals, wolves, deer, even a moose, all torn apart. What kind of place is this? Mateo whispered. Before anyone could answer, a chilling sound echoed through the forest. A guttural snarl that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We formed a defensive circle, weapons ready. Out of the shadows, it emerged. The creature was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It stood on 2 legs, towering over us at nearly 8 feet tall. Its body was muscular yet lean, covered in matted fur. The face, it resembled a wolverine's, but distorted, far more sinister. Claws extended from its hands, each one as long as a dagger. Open fire, I commanded. Bullets ripped into the creature, but it moved with unnatural speed, dodging some shots and shrugging off the ones that hit. It lunged at Noah, slashing across his chest before any of us could react. He fell backward, blood staining the snow. Jax rushed to Noah's side while the rest of us kept firing. Ravi pulled out a grenade. Cover your ears, he yelled, tossing it at the beat. The explosion sent snow and debris flying. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the smoke, the creature leaped at Ravi, pinning him to the ground. With a swift motion, it tore into him. Ravi! Mateo screamed. I aimed carefully and fired at the creature's head. This time, it recoiled, a dark fluid oozing from the wound. It turned its gaze toward me, eyes filled with a malevolent intelligence. Fall back, I shouted. We grabbed Noah, who was barely conscious, and retreated. The creature didn't follow immediately, maybe stunned by the shot. We ran as fast as we could, the cold air burning our lungs. Reaching a rocky outcrop, we took cover. Jax did his best to stabilize Noah, but his wounds were severe. "He's losing too much blood," Jax said grimly. Mateo was shaking. "What is that thing? How is it not dead?" "I don't know," I replied, trying to steady my breathing. "But we need to get out of here." A rustling sound came from above. Before we could react, the creature dropped down, landing between us. It swiped at Mateo, claws ripping through his gear and into flesh. He fell, screaming. I unloaded the rest of my magazine into the creature's back. It howled in pain but remained standing. Jax threw a medical bag at it in desperation, which did little more than distract it for a second. "Over here," I yelled, trying to draw it away from the others. It charged at me. I dodged to the side, grabbing a fallen branch, using it as an improvised weapon. Swinging with all my might, I struck its injured side. It snarled, turning to face me again. Out of nowhere, a flare shot up into the sky. Jax had found Mateo's flare gun. The bright light seemed to disorient the creature. Seizing the opportunity, I grabbed a sharp piece of shattered rock and plunged it into the beast's neck. It stumbled back, making a sound that was a mix between a roar and a wheeze. Dark fluid gushed from the wound. It gave me one last glare before retreating into the forest. I rushed to Jax. "We need to move, now." He nodded, eyes wide. We lifted Noah onto a makeshift stretcher, and with Mateo limping beside us, we headed back toward the research station, hoping to find some way to communicate. The return journey was a blur of adrenaline and fear. Every snapping twig, every distant sound set us on edge. The snowfall intensified, covering our tracks but also slowing us down. Back at the station, we barricaded the entrances. Jax tended to Noah and Mateo as best he could. I searched for any working equipment. In the basement, I found an old generator. After several tense minutes, it sputtered to life, and with it, some of the station systems powered up. I managed to get a weak signal on the radio. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Sergeant Finn O'Malley requesting immediate extraction. Coordinates are..." A burst of static interrupted me, followed by a voice. "Copy that, Sergeant. Extraction team en route. ETA 3 hours. "Make it faster," I urged. From upstairs, a crashing sound echoed. The creature was back, and it was trying to get in. I grabbed whatever I could find, flares, a fire axe, anything. "Jax, how are they?" "Noah's unconscious. Mateo's not much better. Can they move?" "Not likely." The pounding grew louder. Windows shattered as the creature tried to force its way inside. "We can't wait," I said. "We need to confront it." Jax nodded, gripping a metal pipe. We moved into the main hall. The creature burst through the door, wood splintering under its strength. Its eyes locked onto us. "Now," I shouted. We launched our attack. Jax threw a flare directly at its face, momentarily blinding it. I swung the axe, aiming for its leg. The blade bit into flesh, and the creature stumbled, but it was relentless. It swiped at Jax, sending him crashing into a wall. I lunged forward, driving the axe deeper. The creature let out a pained cry but grabbed me, claws digging into my shoulder. The pain was searing, but I couldn't stop. I pulled a flare from my belt and shoved it into the wound on its neck. The sudden burst of light and heat caused it to release me. It thrashed around, knocking over equipment and howling. Smoke began to rise as the flare ignited its fur. The creature staggered before collapsing onto the floor, flames engulfing. I stumbled back, clutching my injured shoulder. Jax groaned, trying to stand. "Is it dead?" he asked. We watched as the flames consumed it. The smell was acrid, a mix of burning flesh and hair. "Looks like it," I replied, breathing heavily. The sound of helicopter blades in the distance was the most welcome thing I'd ever heard. I signaled with another flare through a broken window. The extraction team arrived, medics rushing in to assist. They loaded Noah and Mateo onto stretchers. As we were lifted into the helicopter, one of the team members asked, "What happened here?" I glanced back at the burning station. We found what we were looking for. As we flew away, I couldn't help but think about Dr. Volkoff's journal. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't an isolated incident. The thought lingered as the cold wilderness stretched out below us. Back at base, we were debriefed. Officials took the journal and any evidence we had. They told us not to speak of the mission to anyone. A week later, I received a sealed envelope containing orders for a new assignment. No mention of the previous mission, as if it never happened. Jax and I exchanged a knowing look. "Same old story," he said with a half smile. "Seems that way," I replied. We never saw Noah or Mateo again. Official reports stated they were transferred, but no one could tell us where. Life moved on. Missions came and went, but that encounter in Siberia remained etched in my mind, not as a haunting memory, but as a stark reminder of the unknown things lurking in the far corners of the world. As for Dr. Volkoff, her name was never mentioned again. Another footnote in a classified file. One evening, while packing for my next deployment, I found a small notebook tucked into my gear. It wasn't mine. Flipping it open, I realized it was Dr. Volkoff's secondary journal, filled with sketches and notes about other sightings, other creatures. I closed it and stared out the window. The world was bigger and stranger than I'd ever imagined. Jax knocked on the door. "Ready to go?" I nodded. "Yeah, let's get moving." We headed out, leaving the mysteries behind, for now. There were new missions ahead, and who knew what we'd encounter. I never planned on joining some kind of monster hunting unit. Hell, I never even thought monsters were real until the summer of 2021. I was working as a marine biologist, spending my days tagging and studying the migratory patterns of sharks off the coast of North Carolina. The job paid well, and I got to spend my days out on the open water, far from the noise and chaos of city life. But one night, something happened that changed everything. I was alone on the research boat, a small vessel no bigger than a fishing trawler, anchored just off Cape Hatteras. The ocean was calm, the moon casting a silver sheen across the waves. I had just finished logging data and was getting ready to call it a night when I noticed something odd on the radar. Something large and fast-moving, unlike any marine life I'd ever seen. It moved with purpose, darting in a zigzag pattern toward my boat. I watched the radar in disbelief, trying to make sense of it. Then the boat rocked violently, as if something massive had struck it from below. I rushed to the deck, peering over the side into the dark water. I expected to see a whale, or maybe even a large shark. Instead, what I saw defied explanation. A massive shape, as long as the boat itself, glided just beneath the surface. It was smooth and black, with a thick, serpentine body that moved with terrifying speed. Its head, crowned with jagged, bone-like protrusions, broke the surface for just a moment before disappearing into the depths. My heart raced, my mind scrambling for an explanation, but there was none. I had never seen anything like it in all my years studying marine life. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stayed on the deck, watching the water, waiting for the creature to return. When dawn broke, I made the decision to head back to shore and report what I'd seen, though I knew how crazy it would sound. But as I motored back toward land, something even stranger happened. A sleek black helicopter appeared on the horizon, heading straight for me. It hovered above the water a few hundred yards from my boat, before a man dressed in black tactical gear rappelled down onto the deck. He introduced himself as Agent Harper, flashing a badge that bore no recognizable government seal. "You've seen something you shouldn't have," he said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "We're going to need you to come with us." And that was it. Before I knew it, I was swept up into a world I never knew existed, a world where monsters were real, and there was a secret government agency tasked with hunting them down. They called it the Cryptid Unit, and Agent Harper was their top operative. At first, I resisted. I wanted no part of it. I was a scientist, not a soldier. But Harper was persuasive, and in the end, I had no choice. They knew what I had seen, and they made it clear that my life would never be the same unless I joined them. So I did. I went through the training, learned how to handle weapons, how to track and kill creatures that science had no explanation for. The years passed, and I became good at what I did. Too good, maybe. The hunts became routine, the fear that once gripped me fading into a numb sort of acceptance. But there was one mission just a few months ago that brought all that fear rushing back. We were sent to a remote town in the Pacific Northwest, a place called Black Creek. The town had seen a string of disappearances, all under bizarre and violent circumstances. The locals whispered about a creature in the woods, something ancient and malevolent. Me and Harper were dispatched to investigate. Black Creek was a ghost town by the time we arrived. The streets were empty, the houses abandoned. It was as if the entire population had simply vanished. We set up a base of operations in the old town hall, using thermal imaging and motion sensors to track any signs of life or anything else. It wasn't long before we found what we were looking for. The creature struck at night, moving through the town with silent, lethal precision. We caught glimpses of it on the thermal cameras, a hulking bipedal figure with long, sinewy limbs and a hunched back. Its movements were eerily human-like, but there was nothing human about it. Harper and I followed it into the woods, armed to the teeth with the latest in military hardware. The forest was dense, the trees so thick they blotted out the moonlight. We moved slowly, cautiously, our rifles raised, the darkness pressing in around us. Then we heard it. A low, rumbling sound, like the purr of a big cat, but deeper, more menacing. It came from all around us, echoing through the trees. We stopped, scanning the shadows, but there was nothing to see. "Stay sharp, Ethan. Ethan is the new name for the protagonist," Harper whispered, his voice barely audible over the thumping of my heart. Suddenly, something slammed into me from the side, knocking me off my feet. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me. "Ethan!" Harper shouted, firing his weapon into the darkness. But it was too late. The creature was on me, its claws digging into my chest. I've faced a lot of monsters in my time, but nothing like this. It was like being attacked by a lion, only bigger, stronger, and much more intelligent. It had the face of a wolf, elongated and twisted, with sharp, bone-like spines running down its back. Its eyes, those I remember clearly, were wide, unblinking, filled with an unnatural intelligence. I fought back, using everything I'd learned in my training, but it was no use. The creature was too strong, too fast. It pinned me to the ground, its jaws snapping inches from my face. I could smell its rancid breath, feel the heat of its body pressing down on me. Harper was shouting, firing round after round into the creature, but it barely flinched. I was going to die. There was no doubt in my mind. But then, out of nowhere, Harper did something I never expected. He pulled out a small device from his belt, something I'd never seen before, and activated it. The creature let out a horrific screech, its body convulsing as if it was being electrocuted. It released me, thrashing wildly before collapsing to the ground, dead. I lay there, gasping for breath, covered in blood and dirt. Harper crouched beside me, his face grim. "That was too close," he said, helping me to my feet. "What the hell was that?" I asked, still trying to process what had just happened. "Something we weren't supposed to see," Harper replied, "and something no one else will ever know about. We burned the creature's body that night, reducing it to ashes before anyone could find it. The mission was over and we returned to base, our report classified and buried deep within the agency's archives. No one would ever know what we encountered in Black Creek, and that's how it had to be. But as I sit here now, writing this down, I realize that it doesn't matter. The truth is out there, whether anyone believes it or not. Monsters are real, and they're closer than we think. And sometimes, just sometimes, they win." Harper walked into the room, his face as unreadable as ever. "Ready for the next one?" he asked, his voice steady. I paused for a moment, the weight of the last hunt still clinging to me, knowing there was no other choice. We hunted the things that lurked in the dark, and there was always another hunt waiting. I strapped on my gear, checked my weapon, and followed him out into the night. The monster may have been dead, but the job was far from over. The Beast of Blackwood County. Back in 2009, things were different in Ashburn, Montana. I'd been patrolling these streets for 7 years, and while the town wasn't big, barely scraping past 3, 0 residents, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. Not exactly what you'd call exciting, but I liked it that way. My name's Ethan Hayes, and most days my job meant breaking up bar fights, dealing with noise complaints, and once in a while chasing off some deer that wandered too close to town. Peaceful enough for a guy who grew up in a rougher part of the state. But I'll tell you what, it was one hell of a place to raise a family. Now, I'm no saint. I'm divorced, which is what happens when your wife doesn't want to spend her life with someone who smells like stale coffee and gun oil. Can't blame her, though. I was too wrapped up in my work, thinking that because I was out there trying to keep this small town safe, it meant I was doing right by my family. Joke's on me. Now it's just me, a rickety old house, and a dog that sheds enough hair to knit a sweater every week. But it's quiet, and I'm okay with quiet, usually. The day things started going south wasn't anything special at first. It was a Tuesday, I remember, because the diner had their half-price pie special, and I wasn't about to miss out on that. But before I could even get my truck started, a call came in from dispatch. "Ethan, you there?" It was Betty's voice, crackling through the radio. She was as dependable as they come, having been dispatching for Blackwood County for nearly 2 decades. "Yeah, Betty, I'm here. What's up?" "We've got a call from the Miller's farm. Susan's saying something's out in the fields, and well, She's not making much sense. You want to swing by and check it out?" I sighed, glancing at the diner wistfully. "Yeah, sure, I'm on it." The Millers were good people, old-school farmers. If Susan was calling in, it wasn't just a coyote scaring the livestock. As I pulled up the dirt road leading to their place, I noticed the lights were already on in their barn, which was odd for this time of day. Usually they were early-to-bed folks, and it was barely sundown. Susan was standing outside, arms crossed and pacing nervously. The moment she saw my truck, she waved me over like she was afraid I'd vanish if she didn't. "Ethan, thank God. There's something out there in the cornfield. Robert went out to check an hour ago, and he hasn't come back." Her voice was frantic, but what got me was the look in her eyes, real fear. "All right, slow down," I said, stepping out of the truck. "What exactly did you see?" Susan shook her head, swallowing hard. "I don't know. I didn't really see it, but the dogs, they were barking like mad, and then just stopped. Robert said he was going to scare whatever it was off, but I haven't heard from him since." I took a breath, nodding. Robert was a stubborn man, sure, but he wasn't the type to just disappear without saying something. "Stay here, Susan. I'll go take a look." Now, walking into a cornfield at dusk isn't exactly on my list of favorite things. The rows of corn, taller than me by a good foot, blocked out the sky, turning everything into a dim, shifting maze. I had my flashlight and my sidearm, but it didn't take long for the whole place to start feeling off. The air felt heavy, and the only sound was the crunch of dry leaves under my boots. "Robert," I called out, but my voice seemed to get swallowed by the stalks. Nothing. I was about halfway through the field when I found the first sign that something wasn't right. The ground was torn up in places, like something heavy had been dragged through the dirt. There were no clear prints, just long, deep grooves that led further into the field. "Robert," I yelled again, louder this time, hoping for any kind of response. Still nothing. I followed the marks, my hand resting on my holster. I'm not one for jumping to conclusions, but something about this scene didn't sit right. The ground was too torn up, the silence too complete. And that's when I smelled it, something metallic, like copper. Blood. I crouched down, running my flashlight over the dirt. Sure enough, there was a smear of dark, wet blood soaking into the earth. I followed the trail, my heart starting to hammer in my chest, and then I saw him, Robert. Well, what was left of him, anyway. He was crumpled near the edge of the field, his torso torn open like something had tried to peel him apart. I've seen my fair share of gruesome scene scar accidents, bar fights gone too far, but this was different. His body was mauled in a way that didn't make any sense, like something with claws had gotten to him, but bigger than any animal I knew about. I stumbled back, cursing under my breath, trying to keep my stomach from turning. That's when I heard a low, guttural snuffling sound from the rows ahead. Something was out there. I drew my gun, standing up and aiming the flashlight forward. The light caught movement, just a glimpse, but enough to make out a shape. It was hunched, walking on all fours, but too big for any animal that should have been out there. Not a coyote, not a bear. Hell, I didn't even think wolves got this far south. But this thing, it was wrong. Like it had the body of a large cat, but bulkier, almost like a grizzly, but more distorted. It moved fast, darting between the corn rows, and for a second, I thought maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the dark was playing tricks on me, but the blood soaking into Robert's shirt said otherwise. Whatever it was, it had killed him fast. I should have called for backup, but I didn't. Something about the situation felt immediate, like if I didn't deal with it now, it was going to head for the house. Susan was still out there, probably waiting by the barn, completely unaware of what had happened to her husband. I raised my gun, trying to steady my breathing, and followed the shape through the field. The thing stayed low, weaving between the rows, but every now and then I caught a flash of its mottled, fur-covered back. It wasn't making any noise anymore, which unnerved me more than the growling had. As I pushed through the stalks, I felt a sharp crack under my boot. I looked down and saw what remained of a cow skull, dried and cracked from the sun, half buried in the dirt. I cursed under my breath, stepping carefully around it, realizing just how wrong this all was. I reached a small clearing near the edge of the field, where the stalks gave way to a dirt patch near the irrigation ditch. That's when I saw it clearly. The creature was hunched over something, and when it shifted, I got my first real look at it. It had the elongated face of a mountain lion, but its limbs were far too thick, muscular, like a boar's. Its skin was patchy, hairless in places, revealing gray, scaly skin beneath the fur. Its claws, long and curved, were slick with blood as it tore into another body. There was no hesitation. I fired. The shot rang out, deafening in the open air, but the thing barely flinched. I fired again, this time aiming for its head. It let out a shriek, a sound so high-pitched it made my ears ring. Then, in a blur of movement, it darted toward me. I barely had time to move. I felt the swipe of its claws rake against my side, sending me crashing to the ground. Pain exploded in my ribs, but I forced myself up, stumbling backward as the thing crouched, readying for another attack. I aimed again, this time hitting it square in the shoulder. It let out another shriek, but this time it stumbled. The thing was fast, but the shots had slowed it down. It staggered, and in that moment of hesitation, I emptied the rest of my clip into its chest. The thing collapsed, twitching but still alive. I could see its chest rising and falling, ragged, as blood poured from its wounds. I didn't get closer. Instead, I grabbed my radio, calling Betty to send backup now. When the other officers arrived, they stared in disbelief at the thing on the ground. No one could say what it was. There was no name for it. The creature's body didn't vanish, didn't fade into the night. It stayed there, bleeding out on the ground, a solid, undeniable mass of muscle and fur. We had to drag it back to the station with a tractor. We never figured out what it was. And no, we didn't bury it or burn it. The state took care of that, sealed it off, said they'd study it. All I know is Robert's dead, and Susan moved away not long after. Can't say I blame her. T was 3 years ago, right around this time of year, actually. I was 28 then, a guy, 6'2". Let's call me Jake for this story. Behind my place, there's this mountain range. I live in this kind of desert forest mix. The mountain this all went down on was the smaller one, right before a much taller peak. There's this huge valley between them, full of rough terrain and forest, where you get cougars and bears. It's important, you'll see why. The big peak is about 0 feet high, and the one I was on, the foothills, reaches around 0 to 50 feet. So, there I was, hiking around these foothills. Just outside of town, there are these grassy hills and trails. I usually explore the south side, but this day I went north. The first thing I noticed was how much rougher it was. I'm about a mile out of town, still in the lower part of the mountains, and I stumble upon this buried structure. It looked ancient, like it had been there for hundreds of years, all run down and creepy. There was this small door, and inside, a chamber with what looked like an altar and a small metal bowl. It was tiny, not even enough room to stand, and getting through that door would have been a tight squeeze. I immediately got this feeling, like, don't go in there, but I peeked in anyway. The chamber was seriously the size of a doghouse, with a cement block in the middle, probably the altar, and a metal bowl on top. I snapped a few pics and got out of there. I hiked up higher and sat down for a smoke, just scanning the hills. That's when I saw them, two figures up on the hills, staring right at me. They were far, but I could tell. One of them looked at the other, then pointed at me. It was weird. The other one touched him, pointed at me again, and they started coming down the hill, straight towards me. Even from afar, these guys looked tall, and there was something off about them. When I looked, they stopped. Then one pointed at me again. They looked at each other, and I looked away, back at the valley. When I looked back, they were coming down towards me again, until they saw me looking and stopped. I chuckled, but I felt this wave of unease. Then, these two just started running full speed down the hill. I stood up, trying to act cool, like I wasn't freaked out. I thought, I'm just gonna walk away, no big deal. I went down into a basin and started following the main trail back. That was weird, I thought. But then, as I cleared the basin, they appeared on a closer hill right above the trail. They were tailing me, aggressively. One of them yelled something I couldn't understand and whistled. They kept getting closer. I ditched the trail, thinking I'd head straight for town. I went down another hill, thought I'd lost them, but there they were again, on the hill I just came down. One pointed at me, shouted something to the other. They were so close now, I could hear their voices. They started catcalling me, whistling, like, "Hey, where are you going? Come here, boy. Hey, what's up, man? We just want to talk." Their clothes were just bizarre, and their faces pale as ghosts, unusually long. They looked like clowns, but without the makeup. I was descending the last hill towards town, a steep drop to a short cliff. Fuck, I thought. There was no way down. I could hear them getting closer, muttering in these high-pitched voices. They were right there. I called my dad. Let's call him Mike. I should have called the cops, but back then, weed was illegal, and I was already in trouble for it. I thought maybe these guys were cops trying to bust me. I tried to sound casual on the phone. Dad, I need you to come get me, now. I'm near Grandma and Grandpa's place." "Wait, what?" My mom, let's call her Sarah, chimed in. "Jake, what's going on?" "I have no idea what they want," I said, hearing one of them hollering in that creepy voice. They were like 20 yards behind me now. "Dad, I need you now." "Jake, where are you? What the hell is going on?" Both my parents were freaking out. "Two weird guys are following me. I'm by Grandpa's place." "Okay, I'm on my way," Dad said. I hopped a fence onto a paved trail, relieved, and looked back. They were further back now, about 80 yards, looking down like they were hiding when they saw me. They'd somehow gotten to the trail. I walked fast, too scared to look back, hopped another fence into a yard, and just ran. I saw Dad pull up, hopped in. I've never seen him that scared, not even when I was a kid. "Thanks," I said, shaking like a leaf. You okay? What happened? He asked. I told him everything, and later my family. They were all as baffled as I was. I'd never experienced anything like that before. I have no clue what they wanted or why they chased me for over 2 miles. There were more incidents that year, but that's for another time. The thing is, I'd been hiking and camping in those mountains my whole life, and nothing like that ever happened. No matter how well you know a place, you just never know what's out there. It wasn't like I planned to end up in some Alaskan backwater. Seriously, who does that? It was just burnout, man. 10 years of staring at spreadsheets under those god-awful fluorescent lights will mess you up. I was Ethan, a guy who needed an escape, somewhere far away, quiet, and with zero chance of hearing another car horn. That's how I stumbled on Eagle's Rest Lodge during some late-night, half-crazed internet search. The website was all breathtaking views, private ski trails, and complete tranquility. Sounded perfect, even though I hadn't skied since I was a kid and broke my arm. The day I drove up, the sky was this solid sheet of gray, the kind that just sucks the color out of everything. My little rental car was the only thing on the road for miles, and the only other sign of life was the occasional crow, which, let's be honest, is never a good omen. By the time I got to the lodge, the sun was already hiding behind these jagged peaks, and the shadows were getting seriously long and creepy. Eagle's Rest was huge, all dark wood and a roof so steep, it looked like it was trying to touch the sky. It was supposed to be all classic alpine, but honestly, it felt kind of empty. I mean, there were lights on and smoke coming out of the chimneys, but it didn't feel cozy, you know. Still, I figured it was just me being weird from the drive. The parking lot was empty, except for this beat-up old truck with chains on the tires and a bed full of firewood. I grabbed my bags and trudged through the snow to the entrance. The snow was that loud, crunchy kind, and it echoed like crazy in the silence. A little brass bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. The lobby was grand, I guess. Super high ceilings, those big exposed beams, and a massive stone fireplace that was actually roaring. The warmth was amazing, thawing out my face instantly. Behind the reception desk, there's this woman, mid-30s maybe, with reddish-brown hair and this bright, almost too cheerful smile. Her name tag said Clara. "Welcome to Eagle's Rest Lodge," she chirped, all warm and welcoming. But it felt a little rehearsed, you know. "You must be Ethan. We've been expecting you." I nodded, wiping the melting frost from my beard. "Long drive, but I'm glad to be here." "Most people are," she said, and her tone got a little, I don't know, flat. Clara handed me a room key, this heavy brass thing shaped like a pine cone, and pointed me toward the east wing. As she was talking, I noticed her eyes flick toward the big staircase behind me, just for a second. It was subtle, but it set off a little alarm bell in my head. "Is it just me here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Her smile slipped for the tiniest moment. "It's the off-season. Things are quieter this time of year." Quieter. The place felt deserted, but I let it go. Figured she was just trying to sell the whole peaceful getaway thing. My room was on the second floor, overlooking the forest. It was exactly what you'd expect from a fancy ski resort. Thick carpet, wood furniture that looked like it was made from whole trees, and a bed that could have slept a king. I unpacked fast, itching to stretch my leg. The first weird thing happened when I was heading back downstairs. The hallway was lined with all these old photos of the resort, the trails, and groups of smiling skiers from back in the day. I stopped at one, a black and white picture of a bunch of staff members standing in front of the lodge. Something about it bugged me. Their smiles looked fake, their eyes kind of wide and freaked out, like someone was holding a gun to their heads, telling them to look happy. But the real kicker was this jagged scratch right across the middle of the glass, totally blocking out one of the faces. I leaned in, trying to see who was behind the scratch. But just then, the hallway lights flickered, making me jump. I shook it off and headed down to the lobby, where I found Clara stacking firewood by the hearth. She straightened up when she saw me. "Settling in okay?" "Yeah," I said, looking around. "It's just really quiet here." "It's peaceful, isn't it?" "One way to put it," I muttered. Clara smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Not real. Dinner will be served at 6 in the dining hall. If you need anything else, just let me know." I nodded, but as I turned to leave, I caught her watching me, her expression. I couldn't read it. Dinner was in this huge empty dining room with these long tables that looked like they could seat 100 people. The only other person there was this burly guy in his 40s with a beard, sitting way off in the corner. Turns out it was Mark, the ski guide Clara had mentioned. He gave me a nod but didn't say much, just kept to himself. The food was okay, roast chicken and mashed potatoes, but the silence was seriously oppressive. The dining hall felt way too big, way too empty, like it hadn't been used in years. After dinner, I went back to my room and tried to chill. Tried to read the book I'd brought, but my mind kept going back to that scratched-out photo and how weirdly quiet the whole place was. Around 11:00 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I turned off the lamp and lay in bed, listening to the wind rattling the window pane. Just as I was drifting off, I heard footsteps, faint at first, like someone was tiptoeing down the hall outside my room. I sat up, straining to hear. The steps were slow, deliberate. Then they'd stop, then start again. "Hello?" I called out, but the footsteps just stopped. I waited a minute, then got out of bed and opened the door. The hallway was empty, just those dim wall sconces lighting it up. But as I stepped out, I saw something that made my stomach clench. There was a faint trail of snow leading from the end of the hall right to my door. The window at the end of the hall was cracked open, letting in a freezing draft. I hurried over and slammed it shut, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. When I turned back toward my room, I saw it. That photo, the one with the scratched-out face. It was perfectly fine now, no scratch. And the figure in the center, they were staring right at the camera, their face twisted into this knowing look. Needless to say, I didn't sleep a wink that night. Morning came grudgingly, like the sun itself was having second thoughts about showing up at this place. A weak, watery light filtered through my window, accompanied by the low moan of the wind howling over the peaks. I hadn't slept, but I told myself that daylight would make things seem normal. Whatever had happened the night before, the footsteps, the snow, the photo, it could all be explained away, probably. Downstairs, the lodge felt just as deserted as it had the night before. Clara was behind the desk, her smile as bright and hollow as ever. "Sleep well?" she asked, her voice cheerful in that same forced way. "Not exactly," I admitted. There were noises, footsteps, and my window was open. I watched her carefully, looking for any sign that she knew more than she was letting on. Her expression froze for a split second, just a flicker of something behind her eyes. Fear? Guilt? It was gone before I could really process it. Then she gave this practiced little laugh. This old lodge can be a little creaky at night, probably just the wind. I wasn't buying it, but I nodded. I'm meeting Mark for a ski lesson, I said, trying to change the subject. She perked up a little at that. Of course. He'll be waiting for you outside. Stick to the trails and have fun. There was something about her enthusiasm that felt off, like she was trying too hard. It made my skin crawl. Mark was already at the slope when I got there, leaning on his ski poles with this look of mild annoyance. He was exactly what you'd expect from a ski guide at a place like this. Rugged, stubbled, with a face that looked like it had seen a few too many winters. He barely acknowledged me as I approached. "You're late," he said gruffly, even though I wasn't. "Get your gear on." We started with the basics. Mark's instructions were curt, efficient, and totally devoid of any warmth. I got the feeling he didn't want to be there any more than I did. But as we made our way down the trails, something started to shift. The forest around the lodge was stunning, all towering pines and blankets of untouched snow. The air was sharp and clean, filling my lungs with a kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. For a little while I almost forgot about the weirdness of the night before. Almost. "Stick to the marked trails," Mark said suddenly, breaking the silence. His tone was sharper than it needed to be. "Don't wander off, no matter what you see or hear." I glanced at him. "Why? Avalanches?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Something like that." "Something like that?" I pressed. Mark stopped abruptly, turning to face me. His eyes were hard, his voice low. "Look, you came here for some peace and quiet, right? Then take my advice. Stay on the trails. Don't ask questions, and don't go looking for trouble." There was a weight to his words that made my chest tighten. Before I could respond, he turned and started skiing back toward the lodge, leaving me alone with a growing sense of unease. I spent the afternoon on the beginner slopes, trying to shake off the feeling Mark had given me. By the time the sun started to dip behind the mountains, I was exhausted. The warm lights of the lodge beckoned, but as I started back, something caught my eye. At the edge of the tree line, just beyond the marked trail, a figure stood motionless. They were too far away for me to make out any details, but their posture was strange, rigid, unnatural. For a moment, I thought it might be Mark, but the figure didn't move, didn't wave. "Hello," I called out. No response. The wind carried my voice into the trees, but the figure remained still, a dark silhouette against the snow. A shiver crawled down my spine, and not from the cold. Against my better judgment, I edged closer, my skis crunching softly over the snow. The figure stepped back, deeper into the shadows. It wasn't running exactly, but there was something deliberate about the way it retreated, like it wanted me to follow. When I reached the spot where it had been standing, I found nothing but a single leather glove lying in the snow. I didn't pick it up. Back at the lodge, I told Clara about the figure. She was behind the desk again, flipping through a guest registry that looked older than she was. When I mentioned the figure, her smile vanished completely. "You shouldn't have gone off the trail," she said quietly. "I didn't," I replied. "They were right at the edge. Who was it? A guest? Someone from the staff?" Clara closed the registry and looked at me, her expression unreadable. It was probably just a shadow. The snow and trees can play tricks on your eyes. "That wasn't a shadow," I said firmly. "There was someone out there." She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, The bell above the entrance jingled. A man stumbled in, his clothes torn and covered in snow. He looked wild, his hair matted, his eyes bloodshot and darting around the room like a trapped animal. "Don't listen to them," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "They're not here to help you." Clara's face went pale. "Sir, you need to leave." The man ignored her, fixing his gaze on me. "You think you're safe here? You think this place is what it seems? It's not. They're just keeping it happy." "What are you talking about?" I asked, stepping toward him. "Stay on the trails," he hissed, "and whatever you do, don't go into the woods." "Sir," Clara began, but the man bolted, disappearing into the night before anyone could stop him. The lodge fell silent again, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Clara looked shaken, her hands trembling as she picked up the phone. "I need to call someone about this," she said, her voice tight. "You should go to your room." "What just happened?" I demanded. "Who was that?" "Go to your room, Ethan," she repeated, this time with more force. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The man's words played over and over in my head. "They're just keeping it happy." What did that mean? Keeping what happy? A faint tapping sound pulled me from my thoughts. It was coming from the window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My room was on the second floor. There shouldn't have been anything outside that window. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. My heart pounded as I forced myself to turn my head. A shadow was pressed against the glass. It didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there as if waiting for me to acknowledge. Its outline was human, but something about the proportions was wrong, its arms too long, its neck slightly crooked. I stayed perfectly still, afraid that even the slightest movement would invite it inside. The tapping stopped, and then, slowly, the shadow slid out of view. I didn't sleep that night, either. The next morning, I woke to a soft knocking on my door. It was timid, almost hesitant, but persistent enough to drag me out of the restless sleep I'd finally fallen into as dawn broke. I checked the clock on the bedside table. 7:13 a.m. Way too early for comfort. My body protested as I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, the events of the previous night still thick in my memory. "Who is it?" I called out. But there was no answer. The knocking stopped, leaving an uncomfortable silence in its wake. I hesitated before opening the door, half expecting to find another shadow, or worse, nothing at all. Instead, Clara stood there, holding a steaming cup of coffee. She smiled, but her eyes darted past me and into the room, scanning it quickly before meeting my gaze. "Good morning, Ethan," she said brightly, though her tone felt strained. "I thought you might need this after last night. You looked restless when I saw you heading back to your room. Thought I'd check on you this morning." Restless was one way to put it. But something in her demeanor was off. Like she knew more than she was letting on. I decided to test the waters. "Thanks," I said carefully. "That tapping on the window didn't exactly help me sleep." Clara's face froze for a split second before she forced another smile. "The wind can be strange up here, plays tricks on you." "Right," I said, matching her tone. "Wind that casts shadows." She didn't respond to that, but her knuckles tightened around the tray she was holding. After an awkward pause, she gestured down the hallway. "Breakfast is ready if you're hungry. Mark wants to talk to you about your next lesson. He's outside, clearing the snow." "Great," I muttered, already tired of the constant reassurances that everything was fine when it so clearly wasn't. The dining room was empty again, save for a plate of scrambled eggs and toast waiting for me at one of the smaller tables. I ate quickly, the heavy silence of the lodge pressing down on me like a weight. When I finished, I decided to explore the building a little more. Something about this place wasn't adding up, and I wasn't going to find answers by sitting around. The lodge's layout was sprawling, with winding hallways and staircases that seemed to lead nowhere in particular. As I wandered, I noticed small details that I hadn't seen before. Scuff marks on the floors that looked like they'd been hastily cleaned. Door handles that were scratched and worn as if someone had been frantically trying to open them. And then there were the locked doors. Nearly every other hallway had at least one. A heavy wooden door with a small brass plate marked "Staff Only." They didn't look like storage closets, and the idea of an upscale resort having so many restricted areas struck me as odd. Eventually, I found myself in the basement. The air down there was colder, heavier, and it smelled faintly of damp wood and something metallic. Rows of wooden shelves lined the walls, stacked with supplies, bottled water, canned goods, and boxes of firewood. It all seemed normal enough, until I spotted one particular door at the far end of the room. Unlike the others, this one wasn't marked. Its surface was plain, and the doorknob had been replaced with a rusted padlock that looked decades old. It was out of place in an otherwise pristine storage area, and curiosity got the better of me. I glanced around to make sure I was alone before pulling at the lock. It didn't budge, of course, but the chain rattled loudly in the stillness. Frustrated, I scanned the room until I spotted a small crowbar resting against one of the shelves. With some effort, I wedged it under the padlock and pried it loose, the old metal groaning in protest before snapping free. The door creaked open to reveal a small, dimly lit room. The first thing I noticed was the smell, stale and musty, with a hint of something acrid underneath. My flashlight illuminated the contents of the room, and my stomach churned at what I saw. Old maps covered one wall, their edges frayed and yellowed with age. Most of them depicted the mountain, but certain sections were crossed out with thick red X's. A pile of missing person posters sat on a table in the corner, each one bearing the faces of smiling men, women, and even children. They all had the same thing in common: the word "missing" stamped in bold letters across the bottom. But the strangest thing was the equipment. Skis, poles, and snowshoes leaned haphazardly against the walls, their designs outdated by decades. Some looked barely used, while others were broken or twisted, as if they'd been violently bent out of shape. I picked up one of the posters, my hands trembling. The date on it was from 5 years ago, but the man in the photo looked eerily familiar. I realized with a jolt that he resembled the stranger who had burst into the lodge the night before, warning me to stay on the trail. My flashlight caught a glimpse of something else. An old, leather-bound journal tucked beneath a stack of maps. I flipped it open, skimming the entries. The handwriting was shaky, the words frantic. "There's something on this mountain. I've seen it in the trees watching. It knows when you stray from the trails. It's not human. It's not an animal. It's something else." Further down, another entry read, "I tried to leave today. The road was clear, but I couldn't reach it. Every time I thought I was getting closer, the trees seemed to shift. It doesn't want me to leave." The final entry was the shortest, scrawled in uneven letters that looked like they'd been written in a hurry. "They come at night. Don't look at them." A loud clatter behind me snapped me out of my trance. I whipped around, my heart pounding, but the room was empty. The crowbar I'd used to pry the door open had fallen to the floor, though I didn't remember leaving it anywhere near the edge of the shelf. I grabbed the journal and bolted, leaving the door ajar behind me. Clara found me in the lobby an hour later, clutching the journal like a lifeline. She noticed the dirt on my hands and the wild look in my eyes, but didn't say anything at first. Instead, she sat down across from me, her expression guarded. "Where were you?" she finally asked. "In the basement," I said bluntly. "What the hell is going on in this place?" Her face paled, and she glanced around the empty lobby as if to make sure no one was listening. "You weren't supposed to," she cut herself off, shaking her head. "Ethan, there are things you don't understand, things you're better off not knowing." "I think I have a pretty good idea," I shot back, slamming the journal onto the table. "Missing people, shadows in the woods, and now this." Clara flinched but didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You need to leave." "I tried," I said. "The road is blocked." Her silence was confirmation enough. That evening, the power went out. I was in my room, staring at that journal, when the lights flickered and died, plunging the lodge into darkness. A cold, unnatural silence followed, broken only by the distant howl of the wind. I reached for the flashlight I'd left on the nightstand, but before I could turn it on, a familiar sound reached my ears. Footsteps. This time, they were louder, heavier, and they weren't stopping outside my door. They were coming up the stairs. I stayed frozen in place, my heart hammering against my ribs. The footsteps reached the landing and stopped directly outside my room. Then came the tapping, deliberate and unrelenting. I didn't dare move. The handle rattled, and for a terrifying moment I thought it would turn. But then the tapping stopped and the footsteps retreated back down the hall. When I finally worked up the courage to check, the hallway was empty, but a single wet footprint marked the floor just outside my door, leading toward the grand staircase. Whatever this presence was, it wasn't done with me yet. The morning air was colder than it had been since my arrival, almost unnaturally so. Even inside the lodge, the chill seeped through the walls as if the building itself was shivering. I found myself staring out the frosted window in my room, watching the endless white landscape. The lodge felt less like a retreat and more like a trap with every passing moment. Whatever was happening here was escalating, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could endure it. But I wasn't leaving, not yet, not without answers. I found Mark outside, clearing snow from the lodge's entryway. His face was as stony as ever, but his movements were tense, hurried. He barely acknowledged me when I approached, his shovel scraping rhythmically against the frozen ground. "Morning," I said, trying to sound casual. "Rough night?" Mark paused, leaning on the shovel, and shot me a look that felt more like a warning than a greeting. "If you're smart, you'll keep to yourself today." "I think we're past that point," I said, stepping closer. "I found something in the basement. Maps, missing posters, someone's journal. What's going on here?" For a moment, I thought he might actually tell me. His expression softened just slightly, and he opened his mouth to speak. But then he shook his head and went back to shoveling. "You don't want to know." "Yes, I do, Mark," I pressed, my frustration boiling over. "I've seen things, shadows outside my window. Footprints where there shouldn't be any. Something is out there. Stop," he snapped, his voice low and sharp. He straightened, glaring at me with an intensity that froze the words in my throat. "You don't get it. The more you dig, the worse it gets. Whatever you think you're going to figure out, it's not worth it." Before I could respond, He turned and walked away, his boots crunching through the snow. I stood there, seething, but a deeper part of me couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. Every time I pushed for answers, the lodge seemed to push back hard. I spent most of the day in the lounge, pretending to read while stealing glances at Clara. She was stationed at the reception desk, flipping through the same guest registry I'd seen her with before. Every so often, her eyes darted to the front door as if she were expecting someone or something to walk through. The tension in the air was suffocating, and by mid-afternoon I couldn't sit still anymore. I decided to go for a walk, despite Mark's warning. Staying inside felt like surrendering to whatever was closing in around me. The snow was deeper than I'd anticipated, and the cold gnawed at my face as I trudged toward the trails. The sky was a pale gray, heavy with clouds that promised another storm. I stuck to the marked paths at first, the rhythmic crunch of my boots offering some comfort. But as I ventured farther, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stopped, glancing over my shoulder. The woods were still, the only movement the occasional sway of snow-laden branches in the wind. But the unease didn't leave me. It felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then I saw it. A figure stood just beyond the tree line, partially obscured by the shadows. It was the same as before, tall, unnaturally still, its outline vaguely human but somehow raw. My pulse quickened, and I fought the instinct to run. Instead, I raised a hand, a half-hearted attempt at a wave. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I took a hesitant step closer, and that's when it moved, not away but toward me. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost predatory. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, my boots slipping on the icy trail. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice echoing through the silent forest. It stopped, tilting its head slightly as if considering my words. For a brief, terrifying moment, I thought it might speak. But then it turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving behind only the faintest imprint in the snow where it had stood. I didn't follow. I couldn't. My legs felt like lead as I turned and hurried back to the lodge, the shadows of the forest pressing in around me. Clara was waiting for me when I returned. Her face was pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as if to stop them from shaking. "You went out there," she said, her voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. "I had to," I replied, brushing past her. "I needed to see." "You don't need to see anything," she interrupted, grabbing my arm. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." "Then explain it to me," I snapped, yanking my arm free. "Because every time I try to figure out what's happening, I get stonewalled by you or Mark. I'm done being in the dark." She hesitated, glancing around the empty lobby as if afraid someone might overhear. Finally, she sighed and motioned for me to follow her. We retreated to a small office behind the reception desk, where she closed the door and leaned against it. "This place," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "isn't what it seems. The lodge, the mountain, they're connected. There's something here, something ancient. It doesn't want us here, but it won't let us leave either." I stared at her, my mind racing. "What is it? Some kind of spirit? A curse?" "I don't know," she admitted, her eyes darting to the window. "But it's always watching. It knows when someone steps out of line, when someone tries to leave or interfere. That's why Mark and I stay. Because if we don't keep it happy, things get worse." "Keep it happy," I repeated, my stomach sinking. "How?" Clara didn't answer. Her silence was more chilling than any words she could have spoken. That night, the blizzard hit. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the windows and shaking the walls of the lodge. The power flickered once, twice, and then went out entirely, plunging the building into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, my heart pounding as the shadows closed in around me. And then the footsteps started again. They were heavier this time, more deliberate, and they weren't confined to the hallway outside my room. They echoed throughout the lodge, moving up and down the stairs, circling the building like a predator stalking its prey. I pressed myself against the door, my ear straining to listen. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside. My breath caught as I heard the faintest scrape of claws against the wood, followed by a low, guttural sound that didn't belong to anything human. The handle rattled once, twice, and then went still. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, trembling, waiting for whatever was on the other side to leave. Finally, the footsteps retreated, fading into the storm. The next morning, the blizzard had passed, but the lodge was eerily quiet. Clara and Mark were nowhere to be found, and the lobby was empty, save for a thin layer of snow that had blown in through the front door. I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness, but no one answered. I knew then that I couldn't stay any longer. Whatever was happening here, it was beyond my understanding, beyond my ability to fight. I grabbed my things and made my way to the door, praying that the road would be clear. As I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a physical force. The snow was pristine, untouched, as if the storm had erased all traces of what had happened. But as I looked back at the lodge, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the window of my room, a shadow stood, watching me. I didn't wait to see if it moved. I turned and started down the road, my only thought to get as far away from Eagle's Rest Lodge as possible. The road stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by dense, snow-laden pines. The storm had cleared, but the oppressive weight in the air remained. Each crunch of my boots on the frozen ground felt like a countdown. My breath misted in the frigid air, every exhale carrying a fleeting sense of relief that I hadn't stopped moving. I couldn't risk it, not after what I'd seen, not after what I'd learned. And yet the lodge loomed in my mind, a specter I couldn't outrun. I'd barely made it a mile from the lodge when I saw the footprints. They weren't mine, and they weren't fresh. A line of deep, deliberate indentations led off the road into the forest, where the trees were so dense they swallowed the pale light. I stopped, staring at the trail, my heart hammering against my ribs. No, keep going. But something gnawed at me, a thought that had taken root and wouldn't let go. The prints were human, at least they seemed to be. What if they belonged to Mark or Clara? What if one of them had tried to leave, just like me? Against every ounce of logic, I stepped off the road and followed the trail. The trees closed in around me, their branches clawing at the sky. The air was still, the kind of silence that wasn't natural. It muffled everything, including the sound of my own footsteps. The deeper I went, the darker it became, until the world was nothing but shades of gray and black. The trail ended abruptly at a clearing, and what I saw froze me in place. The ground was disturbed, patches of snow churned into a chaotic mess. Broken branches littered the area, and in the center of it all was something unmistakable, a mangled ski pole. Its metal frame twisted like it had been gripped by something impossibly strong. Beside it lay a single leather glove. I took a step closer, my breath shallow, and noticed something else. The snow wasn't just disturbed, it was stained. Dark patches dotted the ground, their edges blurred and frozen. Blood. A sudden rustling broke the silence, and I whipped around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The beam caught the edge of movement, something tall, something fast. It darted between the trees, too quick to make out. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. Then came the sound, low and guttural, like the growl of an animal. But it wasn't an animal. It couldn't be. It was too deep, too resonant, vibrating in a way that made my teeth ache. I ran. By the time I stumbled back onto the road, my legs were trembling, and my lungs burned with every breath. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The forest had swallowed whatever was there, but I knew it wasn't gone. The lodge came into view before I even realized I was heading back toward it. My escape had turned into a retreat, and the sight of the building filled me with equal parts dread and desperation. I burst through the front doors, slamming them behind me, and leaned against the cold wood. The lobby was empty, just as it had been when I'd left, but something was different now. The air inside felt heavier, colder, like the walls were closing in. I called out for Clara, for Mark, but my voice echoed unanswered. And then I heard it, a faint creak from upstairs, like the groan of a floorboard underweight. I froze, my eyes darting toward the grand staircase. The sound came again, closer this time. "Mark," I called, my voice trembling. "Clara?" No response. I crept up the stairs, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with identical doors, each one slightly ajar. A chill ran down my spine as I realized they hadn't been like that before. At the end of the hall, the door to my room stood open. The creaking came again, louder now, and I realized it wasn't coming from inside my room. It was coming from above, from the attic. The pull-down ladder was already extended, its wooden rungs slick with frost. I stared up into the darkness, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to run. But I couldn't. Whatever was happening here, it was centered in that attic. I had to know. I climbed. The attic was vast, its ceiling low and slanted. The air was colder than anywhere else in the lodge, biting at my skin even through my jacket. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung in thick glistening strands. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating stacks of old furniture and crates piled haphazardly against the walls. And then I saw it. In the center of the attic, surrounded by a circle of snow that had no business being there, was a chair. It was old, its wood splintered and gray with age, but it wasn't the chair itself that stopped me in my tracks. It was the figure sitting in it. The man was slumped forward, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His clothes were torn and stained, his skin pale and waxy. But even in the dim light, I recognized him. The stranger. His eyes were open, staring blankly ahead, but there was no life in them. His lips were parted, frozen in a silent scream. I took a step back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. That's when I noticed the writing on the floor, etched into the wood around the chair. It wasn't in English or any language I recognized. The symbols were jagged, chaotic, carved deep into the plank. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment the shadows seemed to move. And then he spoke. It wasn't the stranger's voice. It wasn't even human. It was deep and resonant, a sound that seemed to echo inside my skull. "You shouldn't have come here." The words hung in the air, and I stumbled back, my chest heaving. The figure in the chair didn't move, but the shadows around him did. They stretched and twisted, taking shapes that defied logic, their edges sharp and writhe. I turned and ran, scrambling down the ladder and nearly falling in my haste. The hallway below was darker now, the lights flickering weakly. I could hear it, whatever was in the attic, moving, its presence pressing down on me like a physical weight. By the time I reached the lobby, the air felt suffocating. The shadows were everywhere, pooling in corners and stretching toward me like grasping hands. The front door was open, snow blowing in and coating the floor. I didn't stop. I ran outside, into the cold, into the storm. I didn't stop running until I reached the road. The snow was deeper now, the path barely visible, but I kept going. The lodge faded behind me, its dark silhouette swallowed by the tree. And then, through the swirling snow, I saw it. A pair of headlights cutting through the storm, the faint rumble of an engine growing louder. A snowplow. I waved my arms frantically, stumbling into the road as the vehicle screeched to a halt. The driver, a grizzled man with a thick beard, leaned out the window, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "What the hell are you doing out here?" I didn't have the energy to explain. "The lodge," I gasped. "Something's wrong. Please, just get me out of..." He hesitated, glancing past me toward the trees. For a moment, I thought he might refuse, but then he nodded, jerking his thumb toward the passenger seat. "Get in." The hospital was warm, too warm, and the fluorescent lights burned my eyes. I told the doctors everything, every detail, but their skeptical looks said it all. They humored me, of course, writing things down and asking questions, but I could see it in their faces. They didn't believe me. A week later, a pair of police officers visited my room. They'd investigated the lodge, they said, found it abandoned, no signs of recent activity, no staff, no guests, just an old, decrepit building left to rot in the wilderness. I didn't argue. I didn't tell them about the shadow in the attic or the figure in the chair. I didn't tell them about the symbols or the voice that still echoed in my mind. I just nodded and let them leave, because deep down, I knew the truth. The lodge wasn't abandoned, it was waiting. I don't know what's worse, that no one believes me, or that something like that still exists out there, waiting for the next fool to step into its trap. On a dark, gloomy evening, you would stay inside, right? How about if there was a foreboding atmosphere that gave you chills when you dared to step toward it? For 3 unfortunate people, they were not so lucky to be inside. They had headed into the woods for a week-long camping trip, as they all loved nature. But on the 4th day, when they woke up, something was different. The air had this indescribably sharp, tangy feel to it. It was dark, no light came from above the trees. Of course, they had brought flashlights and batteries. After all, they were going camping in the middle of nowhere. Their minds were slightly foggy for seemingly no reason. It felt like the forest was suffocating them, pinning them down. Since they had packed food for a several-day trip, they were fine for the day. Physically, that is. On the 5th day, they did not dare stray anywhere from their campsite. They could feel eyes on them, even while in their tents. The mood was gloomy, to say the least. Nobody spoke to each other despite being best friends. They did not feel safe, and there was always this intense aura surrounding the campsite. Occasionally, they would hear a twig snap or unnatural breathing from beyond the tree line. The worst part for them is the fact that they had not seen wildlife since day 3. Not even a bug. On day 6, they woke up to find one of the tents missing, along with one of their friends. But there was no noise last night, and it would seem like nothing happened if it was not for the missing tent. That's when the darkness started closing in further, and the wind started up again. This was worse than when there was no wind. Now they could hear nothing and couldn't sleep, knowing if whatever was out wasn't satisfied with one person, and came to take them too, they wouldn't know until it was too late. On day 7, they decided to get out of there. They packed up the few crinkly stale bars they had left, along with a small water bottle with the initials ML on it. But he is not here anymore. As they walked into the tree line, every instinct in their body was screaming at them to go back. But they couldn't, they would die. It was better to die trying to escape than to sit in one place like a sitting duck. They started to hear the voice of their friend from the trees, beckoning them to come check out the cool thing he had found. But the voice just had a strange emptiness to it. That's not him. Don't listen to it, Tim whispered. I know. Evan replied. They started picking up the pace, knowing that there had to be a way out. They had only walked for about 2 miles to get to their campsite, and they had already walked a mile. Although that does not help a lot, considering they had no clue if they were going the right direction. Hey, did you bring that? Tim stopped mid-sentence, as when he looked back, Evan was not there. Tim broke into a cold sweat, knowing whatever horrendous thing was out there only had one target left. He tried to maintain his cool, but not after long he broke into a jog, then a sprint. As he was sprinting, he heard giggling. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. Then an arm was thrown in front of him. An arm. And not just any arm, it was the torn-off arm of Evan at that. He screamed, and as his attention was pulled towards the arm of his friend that had been with him since preschool, he tripped on a rock. The giggling stopped, and he wasn't sure what was worse, the giggling or the absence of it. He just laid there, too devastated to get up. There is no way out. I was never going to make it. Tim started laughing, realizing this was it. All because of a stupid camping trip his friends him are all going to die. So, I am sure all of you have heard of the story that has been going around recently. Especially in such a small, remote town like this. I'm talking about the one about those campers that went missing. They found them. Apparently they were all found dead. Mutilated. The cops are not sure what type of animal could cause that damage, but they are chalking it up to animals scavenging and eating the bodies before they found them. They were only able to figure out what they were dealing with because of the strange story that has been going around. Nobody knows who wrote it, but for this video, we are going to stay for 7 days at the location where the bodies were found, just like those campers. Robert paused the tape, looking down in shame. I never knew something like this would happen. I wish I had never gone to that place, Robert stammered. We know. But we need you to play the recording. I know it must be traumatic to watch, but we need you here to explain what was happening while you were there, and so if we have any questions, we can ask you. A gruff-looking cop said. He had a certain tone to his voice. You could tell just by his tone he had seen things that no one should ever see. Things that no human should be subjected to viewing. My name is John. The cop continued. Listen, we can take it slow if you would like. But we would like to get through it as fast as possible. We are not sure what is responsible for whatever is happening out there, but we would like to kill it before it decides to move on to other places, John stated. After a few minutes of back and forth, Robert agreed to play the tape. Reluctantly, that is. Robert started up the tape again, and it started playing. Just so everyone knows, we realize the danger this poses, so we have a group of 4 people outside the forest with a radio. They are ready to come in here at any moment and help. Anyways, I will see you on the next recording. John stood up and put the next tape in. Alright, so day 1 has actually been really nice. It was sunny all day and the birds were chirping all day. I really am starting to think that was just a lie. Although, it did say the weird stuff started happening around day 3 if I remember correctly. Well, knowing things that go around the internet, I just expect a nice week-long camping trip with my friends. Anyways, that has been day 1 of the trip. I will see you in the next recording. If there is one. Ooh, you. Just kidding. See ya. As John stood to put the next tape in, Robert spoke up. Can we take a break? I don't want to watch anymore. I don't think I can handle seeing any more of the recordings today. John paused, remaining stoic as he had this entire time. Sure. May I ask why? Nothing has even happened yet. The recording seemed pretty cheerful if you ask me. I would rather not answer. Please just leave. I will play the next 2 tomorrow, but I need to prepare myself. Sorry. Robert looked down again. All right. See you tomorrow. John replied as he headed for the door. Robert watched as John left the room, entered the hallway, opened the creaky door, slammed it shut, and left. Sure enough, the next morning, a muddy police cruiser pulled into the driveway, and John walked out. Along with him, a skinny, brown-haired man came out the other side. He seemed rather unhappy to be here. Once they reached the door, Robert rushed over and let them in. Are you ready to play the tapes? Or do I need to come back some other time? Although I am just saying, if you don't play those tapes we are going to have more casualties than we already have, John said. More casualties? What do you mean? Robert inquired. The other man spoke up saying sorry, he meant delays. We have been doing the report on the casualties of that camping trip, so I am sure he just mixed up the 2 words. Also, the longer you take, like John said, the more delays in killing this thing there will be. By the way, my name is Eddie. Eddie said, glancing at John with stern eyes. Nice to meet you, Eddie. Let's get this over with. Robert muttered. They walked to the living room, which was cozy, but had such a depressing feel to it. Robert put the next tape in, and they all sat down. Welcome to day 2 of going to a forest that a horrible monster supposedly lives in. So far, nothing has happened. I am starting to really think that the story is just a big hoax. So, for now, John suddenly said, wait, pause it. Robert did as he requested. Should you rewind that a bit? Okay, stop, right now, John said. Do you see that? Right there, in between the 2 trees. What is that? John asked. I don't know. I didn't see it while we were there, Robert said aghast. How in the world did you not see that? You should have gotten out of there right as you saw that thing, John yelled. What? What did you want me to do? Watch the recording with my imagination? Are you stupid? We don't bring our TVs out into the middle of nowhere for camping trips, Robert yelled. Eddie followed up with, all right, everyone settle down. John, this was a traumatizing experience for the poor boy. Don't be yelling at him. John took a photo of the thing and put it in a folder. Without another word, they unpaused. It's just a big hoax. So for now, we are going to have lunch. It's a pretty plain lunch. Just some goldfish and a ham and cheese sandwich, along with a can of Coke. The recording stayed silent for a few minutes as he was eating his lunch. Then, after finishing his lunch and walking around for a bit, he finally talked to the camera again. Oh my gosh, I just realized something. We left like 80% of our food with the boys outside of the forest. Oh man. Well, I will call them in, I guess. Hey, you guys there? They replied with, yeah. Do you need something? Well, we actually left most of our food with you guys. Could you please come in and bring it to us? Sure thing. Oh, thank God we have them here. We would have to make the hike out and back in again if we didn't have them. The recording passed for about 23 minutes before the radio went off. It was the guys outside the forest who had been hiking in to bring the food. Hello, is anyone there? Yes, I am here. What's up? Hey, you guys aren't pulling a prank on us, right? If you are, quit messing around. It's freaking us out. What? No, are you guys okay? What's happening? Well, we are hearing a lot of twig snapping. And I can feel eyes on me. Something is whispering out there too. Seriously, this is not funny. Please stop. It's... A high-pitched noise suddenly came out of the radio. There was screaming that would cut in and out, along with the sound of flesh being torn and bones cracking. The entire time, Robert frantically called into the radio, begging to know what's going on. After only 30 seconds or so, the noise from the radio stopped. This is when everything went downhill, Robert muttered. We had no idea what was going on. We didn't have much food, and that's when the rain started. Dear God, the rain, it never stopped. It was an onslaught of drop after drop all night, the next day for so long. This is the last tape. I am going to need a break first, though. Robert was on the verge of a full-on panic attack. Calm down. We'll take a break. I have some calming pills. Here, I take them quite often. John pulled out some pills from his pocket and handed them to Robert. Robert shakily took the pills and a glass of water and ate them. Eddie got up and found his way to the kitchen, where he made peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. Hey, do you guys like your bread toasted? Eddie asked. No, I prefer it untoasted for PB and J, John said. Robert followed up with, same here. Thanks. John and Robert sat there, waiting for their food. John initiated a conversation. Hey, I heard that the feds are coming to take over the case. They are bringing all of us in for questioning in a few days. Really? Is this really that important? Robert asked, puzzled. I guess so, but I must say, be careful around the feds. With something like this, I am sure they don't want anybody knowing about it. I bet they will launch a cover-up. Don't say too much. If you say too little, they will get suspicious. If you say too much, you will probably never be seen alive again. John said, as he cracked open a beer. You say that so casually, are you serious? I can't just let them cover this up. These were my friends that died. My family. Robert yelled. I know, kid, I know. But if you want to live, you're gonna have to deal with it. I know from personal experience. These guys are no joke. I have seen so much in this small town. I bet this place is their little experiment zone. John whispered, leaning in and putting his hand on Robert's shoulder. Eddie walked in with the sandwiches. You ready? Eddie asked. Robert squirmed on the couch but nodded. They started the final tape. It was pouring, the lens was wet, and you could barely hear anything over the rain. I don't tknoubut join butoin bag tspfe. His words were inaudible after that. The rain was too loud to make anything else out. They tried to get Robert to tell them what they were saying during the recording, but Robert was frozen from fear and couldn't speak. After this, the four headed out on the trek back to the town through the woods. One of them was seemingly carrying a hunting rifle. The four inaudibly shouted to each other, until there was a scream, and then a gunshot. Through the camera, all it seemed to be was a quick bang, an explosion of light, and in that brief moment, they saw a tall, lanky, twisted monster. It dropped what seemed to be the body of one of the four, as they all rushed over to it, screaming and crying. The man seemed to still be alive, but you could see his insides, and he was losing way too much blood to survive. At that moment, the body was gripped by an unnaturally large hand and pulled off into the woods. The three hysterically shouted as they got up and started running. When they looked behind them, they could see the outline of the thing that was chasing them. It was right behind them. It was as if it was toying with them. It easily reached out its slimy, meaty hand and slammed the one farthest behind into a tree. All you could hear was what sounded like pleading from the man that had been grabbed, as the thing crawled up into the trees, the man with it. The last two at this point were completely silent, and the water was up to their ankles. It seemed to be a struggle to run or even move at this point. I am sure anyone who has tried running in water would understand that. Without warning, the camera was dropped down onto a rock that was exposed above the water, and you could see what seemed to be a tree grab whoever was holding the camera and pull him up by the neck in the trees as he kicked around and struggled. Seconds later, the rain falling from there became completely red. The last man, the one with the hunting rifle, saw the camera and picked it up as he was running by. You could barely make out the man's face, but it was Robert. He had an expression of great relief as he turned the camera to show what was just in front of him, the end of the forest. There was no rain out there. It wasn't raining, and none of the rain from inside the forest poured out there. He threw his hunting rifle, seemingly to run faster, and was seconds away from getting out of there. As he was, the monster jumped right in front of him. It must have been toying with its victims, like it knew it was going to kill them either way. It seemed this forest was its domain, where it had free rein to change the weather and anything else it pleased. It snatched Robert and killed him in a way that was too brutal to say. A wide grin was plastered on its face as it transformed into Robert, picked up the camera, and walked out of the forest. It was a rather chaotic day at the police station, courtesy of the reports they had been investigating. Recently, campers had been going missing in a nearby forest and would be found killed in extremely brutal ways. None of them were prepared for something like this. It was the biggest thing to happen to this town in decades. To make it all the more stressful, they had to try their best to keep the details of these deaths under wraps, as per request of the government, and everyone was being too overworked to question why they were prying into something seemingly small like this. The usual energy of the station was calm and collected, but in the past few days it had just been piles of work. Everything felt like go, all day. Everyone was hustling, bumping into each other and drinking unhealthy amounts of coffee. "Hey, we're going to take a break. Want to join?" one of the woman's coworkers asked. "Oh, sure. What do you have for lunch?" she asked. "Let's see, I have a heated up grilled cheese, and for a drink, I've got a Coke." The coworker, Patrick, replied. She was taken aback by just how small he was, despite seeing him every day. Patrick wasn't exactly short. He was about the average height for a man in his early 20s, but he was so scrawny. You would think he is not fit for a job with the title police officer. But here he is. She stood up and they headed towards the break room. Even now, they could see the flashes of cameras and the chaos of news reporters from all over the U.S. scrambling to speak over each other and ask questions from outside the building. Somehow, the story had got large amounts of attention from all over the U.S., but it was going to blow over soon, so they tried their best to ignore it for the time being. Although, Patrick did frequently complain about the deaths of those campers being capitalized on by local business owners, because these business owners knew this was probably a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make enough money to last for years. They opened the door to the break room and were promptly greeted by their coworkers. Patrick sat down first, as he was more sociable than she was. "So, how are you guys doing?" Patrick asked. "Well, I am still alive, so not that bad," one of the other coworkers, Jackson, replied. The woman had a troubled look on her face as she spoke up. "Hey, have you guys seen Eddie or John? They haven't come back from that one house." Patrick looked up at her with a puzzled look on his face. "Yeah, now that I think about it, they really haven't. You should call in, just to make sure they are all right," Patrick said. "Well, wait until after our break is over at least," Jackson said. Jackson was extremely energetic and always seemed like he wanted to party. Other than that, he was fine. But it rather bothered the woman, Spoya, as you never knew what he was going to say. Sophia never said anything about it, but it was really bothering her that at a time like this he couldn't care less for the well-being of his coworkers. Sophia politely smiled and said, "Sorry, this could be urgent. I will be right back if they confirm that they are fine." And she walked out of the room. After leaving the room, she turned on her radio. "John, Eddie, are you guys okay? I am just checking in. You are taking much longer than expected," Sophia said, and sat there anticipating the crackle of the radio, and then hearing their voice. But it never came. She waited for over 30 minutes for a response, before getting out of her chair and storming into the break room. "Can somebody come with me?" They didn't respond. "It should just be a quick checkup on them," Sophia asked, clearly worried. Jackson glanced up, before nodding. "I'll go. You guys go enjoy your lunch." Jackson stood up before following Sophia to her police cruiser. "This is really out of character for you. Usually you couldn't care less about anyone else," Sophia said, eyes locked on the road. "I guess so. But I have been on edge because of whatever is out there killing people," Jackson replied, looking out the window. The atmosphere in the car was very tense, as they expected to see nothing out of the ordinary, but were preparing for the possibility of seeing something grisly. As they approached the home of Robert Frontman, it towered above them. It was a house atop a small hill, very isolated from the rest of the town. They noted that John's police cruiser was still in the driveway, which was a good sign. Their police cruiser slowed to a halt, and Sophia and Jackson stepped out. There was an uneasy silence, no noise emitted from anything other their breath and the sound of the gravel crunching beneath their feet. Jackson tightened his grip on his gun, despite there being no immediate danger. They made their way up the steps, and to the door. They knocked on the front door and waited. They strained their ears, desperately listening for the sound of footsteps, but nobody came. "Should we head in?" Sophia asked. Jackson nodded. They used a lock-picking technique that they had learned in training, and got the door unlocked. They cautiously opened the door, and were greeted to a bloodied mess. There were bullet holes all over the walls, along with these strange, long scratches. There was blood everywhere, and the furniture was flipped upside down and thrown all over the place. It was a wreck. It was something that you couldn't put into words, something so horrific you would have to see it to realize the horror of it. You could barely recognize the two bodies strewn about the house, only recognizable by what was left of their uniforms. But what you could tell was that they put up one heck of a fight. Jackson looked at Sophia with pure disgust and horror, and she shared the same expression. Sophia shakily pulled out her radio and stuttered into it. "We need BB, backup. John and Eddie are dead. And no sign of Robert." As Sophia stood there shaking, trying to wrap her head around what she was seeing, Jackson spoke. "What the tunnard happened here?" Jackson said, clearly scared, although he tried his best not to show it. "And where is Robert?" Jackson spewed out, his fear quickly replaced by anger. What would even do something like this? Jackson was now visibly angry, confused, and rightfully so. Sophia snapped out of her trance and saw the state Jackson was in. She realized that although she was scared beyond belief, one of them needed to be level-headed, or at the very minimum act like they were confident. She cautiously walked towards him as he yelled incoherently, and said, "Jackson, calm down. We will figure out who did this. But for now we need to assess what happened." Jackson paused for a moment and looked as though he was going to say something snarky, but ultimately decided against it. This confused Sophia. She had never once seen this side of Jackson. He was never kind or compassionate, and always said what was on his mind, whether it was kind or not. Jackson then glanced at Sophia, looked down to the ground, took a deep shaky breath and said, I'm sorry. It's a lot to take in at once. I'm not doing so well with handling all of this," he said, gesturing all around them. After that, they stood there in silence, surveying the carnage that surrounded them. Soon enough, more cops arrived, along with the press. Sophia always hated the press. They were so inconsiderate. She could bear them when they were waiting outside the police station. But she finally snapped when they followed the cops around like a lost puppy. It felt like borderline stalking. She had just seen something horrific, and all they cared about was getting attention from the media by forcing people to disclose what they had seen, even if it was against their wishes. They never backed down until they got what they so desperately desired, the truth. Did it ever occur to them that people lie, especially on something high-profile like this? Sophia just didn't get it. After briefing the other officers, Sophia steeled herself so as to not look shaken when she left the building. The press would be all over her if she was, and the cops would get even more unwanted attention than they already have. She walked to her cruiser, head down the entire time. The shudder of cameras and incoherent nonsense coming from the mob of news reporters was overwhelming, and she just wanted to leave, get the day over with. Once she got in, she breathed a sigh of relief, took the car out of park, and sped off towards the police station. When she got there, the chief was waiting for her. I am deeply sorry for you and Jackson. I can't even imagine what you had to see over there. I got the gist of it through the radio. You can take a few days off if you would like," he said, forcing himself to make eye contact. You could tell he didn't want to, and was truly sorry that Jackson and her had to be the first to witness such a horrific sight. "Thank you. I cannot say how grateful I am to have you as our chief," Sophia replied. The chief was a kind man. He was very fit for the role of chief. He has always been considerate of others and cared for their well-being. He was also just really approachable and really did seem like he cared. Sophia promptly left and drove home in a daze. It was like she was on autopilot. She grabbed some wine from the counter and sat on the couch. Her eyes were blank, it looked. They were staring into nothingness. Her house was only about a 5-minute drive from the station, which was really useful, especially when something like this occurs. Not like anything like this has ever happened before. She was just one of the unlucky ones who saw it. Staring off into the abyss, she unknowingly drank from her wine glass. Before she knew it, the whole bottle was gone. But she didn't care. The more she drank, the better she felt. Mentally, at least. She got up and grabbed 2 more bottles. She couldn't help but continue drinking in a frenzy, desperately trying to get rid of the unwelcome memories she now has to deal with. She woke up the next morning, exhausted emotionally and physically. She noticed that her wine bottle that was full the night before was now empty, and there were 2 empty ones next to it. She had no recollection of the night. It was all a blur to her. All she wanted to do was drink herself to sleep. She just wanted to forget about the bodies, the carnage, and all the good times she had with John and Eddie. They were the best. They never made any moves on her, just genuinely wanted to be friends. They always cared for her when she was feeling down, and now they're both just a handful of blood splatters. Sleeping never helped her escape. It was torture being awake or asleep. She had nothing but nightmares about that day. You always think you can get over something like that quickly until you are the one placed in the situation, the one seeing the horror. She had no energy, no will to do anything. All she did was lie down and drink herself to sleep, day after day. Jackson, on the other hand, was rigorously training. He hadn't taken it so lightly either, but he manifested his emotions into motivation and energy. He was dead set on finding and killing whatever had done this. If Jackson wasn't researching, he was at the shooting range or the worn-down gym. He woke up the next morning after a particularly long day. He knew what he had to do. Today had to be the day, it just had to. Today was the day he finally found out what had killed John and Eddie. He fumbled around his desk, looking for the pull switch on his lamp. He finally found it, pulled it, and his room flooded with a dim light. He got up and walked to his bathroom. After taking a shower in the dark, dingy, cheap apartment he lived in, he got dressed in the clothes he had worn for years. He flossed his teeth and opened the drawer where his deodorant and toothbrush were. As he opened it, it unhinged and his things fell everywhere. Jackson stood there, clenching his fists and trying to maintain his cool. Ever since the day he went to Robert Fruntman's house, he has had a less than ideal temper. He sighed, kneeling down to pick his things up. He would complain to the landlord, but he knew he couldn't afford to pay rent if it's raised, nor could he afford to be on his landlord's bad side. Every time he met with his landlord, all he wanted to do was yell and complain about all the things wrong with this god-awful apartment. But he can't, especially with this landlord, who is prone to anger and loves having power over people. Jackson can't give him a reason to abuse said power. Jackson picked up his toothbrush, realizing just how disgusting his floor was. "I'll clean it later. Today will be a busy day," he said. He twisted the knob on the faucet, and it sputtered to life, pouring out water. He washed his toothbrush off and brushed his teeth. After picking everything up and putting it on the countertop, he put on his deodorant, combed his hair into something somewhat acceptable, and headed to his car. He zipped down the almost empty streets, making his way to the police station. After arriving, he parked his car and carefully opened the driver's door. The driver's door was quite banged up after he had lost his cool the day before. It looked as if it would fall off onto the street at any second. After successfully getting out of the car without unhinging the car door, he very carefully closed it and sighed in relief. He then made his way to the door of the police station. Just like before, the press was all over this place. They were still screaming over each other, shoving others out of the way. They reminded him of caged animals. He slowly made his way through the crowd, as they directed their overwhelming amount of questions and screaming towards him. Clearly, they remembered him from before. It was claustrophobic. Jackson admired celebrities for being able to handle this. He couldn't even imagine having to deal with this any time they went somewhere, in public for the rest of their life. After a considerable amount of squeezing and shoving, he got to the door. He took a deep breath and walked in. Despite looking like an absolute mess, because of many reasons, such as getting little to no sleep, he expected to be greeted by his coworkers, because as far as he knew he was good friends with them. But, when they saw him, they treated him like a stranger. He waved, but got no response. Not even Patrick said anything. They refused to make eye contact with him, and tried their best to not glance up as he walked by. As he walked to his desk, it really started to get under his skin. They were making him feel like a freak, an outcast. It felt like they saw him as the killer of John and Eddie. Why all of this? Just because he was among the first to arrive at the crime scene. Because he got a few days off work. Why? He took a few deep breaths, decided that he was overreacting, and tried his best to justify their behavior. Maybe they just didn't know what to say. He got to his desk and started digging. He knew the department had to have something on whatever killed John and Eddie, At the very minimum, a connection to other cases, or perhaps a few leads. He sat down at his desk, pressed the power button on his PC, and started searching. He searched for the case of John and Eddie, and after some looking, he found it. He carefully analyzed it, searching for any reference or clue as to what had killed them. After a little while, he realized that he overlooked something huge. He scooted closer to his monitor and sneered. He had never regarded what they were sent to that house for. He felt like an idiot. This was what he was looking for, the big break he so desperately needed. Apparently, Robert was the only survivor of the most recent massacre. Or at least it was the most recent massacre in this town, and Robert happened to have taped the entire thing. They were there to investigate these tapes. Jackson furrowed his brow, confused as to why they reviewed the tapes at Robert's house. Usually, you would review everything here at the station. He continued to scroll down the report, looking for anything on that. Buried at the bottom of the report, it said, "These tapes were reviewed at Robert Frontman's home, as he requested them to be. Robert Frontman refused to show the tapes otherwise." After reading this, Jackson quickly stood up and ran towards the door. His mind was racing, and he knew that Robert had something to do with this. Something was going on, and he just put the pieces together. Robert wanting the cops at his house with him away from civilization, and not being anywhere to be seen at the crime scene. It all fits together to make a full picture. It was Robert. He did this. He paid no attention to the press as he exited the station with a scowl on his face. How did the police not already put this together? Was this a cover-up? Were they hiding all this from him? Why haven't they informed him about this? What's going on? He shoved anyone in his way, getting through the crowd as fast as he could. Once he reached his car, the press was following him. He threw open his door, and it finally snapped. It skidded across the ground before coming to a halt a few feet from the car. But he could care less. He turned on the car, took it out of park, and tried to drive out of the parking lot. But he couldn't. The stupid mob of people were in his way. He honked again and again. But they didn't listen. He took a shaky breath, his face hot with anger, and pushed on the gas. He narrowly avoided the news reporters as they scrambled to get out of the way. They looked at him like he was a madman. And so what if he was? He doesn't care anymore. The only thing he cared about was finding Robert, and putting a bullet or two in his head. He wanted to hear him scream, watch him tremble as he pleaded for mercy. He wanted to see the look of fear in his eyes as he shot him, and watch the life drain out of them. The brisk, cool air from outside blew against his face, and he shivered. He already regretted not being more cautious when opening his door, but he had more pressing matters at hand. He sped down the streets, breaking the law multiple times. He went 60, then 70, then 80 miles per hour, as the air relentlessly tried to keep his eyes closed. He ran plenty of red lights, the honking from other cars quickly drowned out by the sound of the roaring wind. He knew he would very likely lose his license and be arrested. But he needed to find Robert, and he couldn't care less about the consequences. Sophia stumbled out of bed and felt her chest sink. The room was spinning, and she felt like she was going to puke. She slowly made her way to her bathroom, which wasn't very far. Her house was very modern and very compact. Everything was close, and the house had an extremely simplistic design. Despite it being so small and easy to maintain, it was filled with trash. The trash can was overflowing and smelt like death. The sink had too many dishes to count, and she was certain there were a few spiders living in it. The floor was filled with grime and wrappers. You felt like you caught a disease just by walking in the place, and God knows how bad it smelt there. She shakily opened the creaky door to the bathroom, before kneeling down in front of the dusty, gross toilet. The bathroom was just as disgusting as the rest of the house, if not worse. She gagged and then pooped in the yellow-stained toilet. Memories of the sight of the bloodied mess of a house came to mind, and she pooped again. She remembered how it smelt in Robert's house. An overwhelming metallic smell. She remembered the hand on the door handle, with no arm attached. Just a bloody, dripping hand. She remembered the lone phone sitting on the floor with a cracked screen, the numbers 911 dialed. She remembered everything all too vividly. She noticed how gross the bathroom was for the first time. She then shuddered, as the fact that her house was just as horrific as the one that put her in this state in the first place set in. It was like she was actually thinking straight for once. Then she noticed how gross her hair was, and was repulsed. It was greasy, tangled, and matted. She looked like a shriveled shell of her former self, like a different person, in all the bad ways. She wouldn't even need any makeup, or anything else to fit the role of a creepy ghost girl in a cliche horror movie. She wanted to take a shower, but didn't have the energy. She felt alone and hopeless, powerless. She just sat back and put her head on the wall afterwards, crying. Her tears dropped on the black and white tiled floor, pushing some of the grime from the area where the tear dropped. She sniffled, looking down at how clean the floor could be. It was then she realized she can clean this. A profound feeling came over her, and an energy that she hadn't felt in days suddenly came to her. She immediately stood up and decided it was time to get her crap together. She can't live the way she was living for much longer. The pills the doctor prescribed looked so warm and inviting, beckoning her to just take them all at once. It got more and more tempting each depressing, drunken day she lived. She had to change, and soon. She hadn't had this type of clarity in days, and although she was confused that it came so suddenly, and for really no reason, she welcomed it with open arms. She first dug through her closet and found some rather dusty cleaning supplies, and got straight to work. She first cleaned the bathroom, wiping off the counters and toilet. She vacuumed and mopped the floor, and it looked like a different place entirely. She then took a shower, and fixed her hair to the best of her ability, since it was in very bad shape. She felt good for once, like the world wasn't slowly squeezing tighter and tighter until she popped. But this was short-lived. She headed back to her room, and looked at how much of a mess it was. She felt like somebody started flicking a light switch on and off repeatedly. She would have energy, and in the middle of doing something, her energy would be erased, like it was never there. She collapsed onto her bed and sighed. She couldn't tell if it was a sigh of relief or despair. She couldn't tell anything these days. She hadn't even left her house in what felt like months. There was never any natural sunlight coming in. Her blackout curtains were always drawn. Her house was barren of life or happiness. Neither ever seemed to come knocking. She wasn't sure what was worse, this bipolar energy one second and then none the next, or just having no energy. This was more hard for her to handle than only being depressed. Now she didn't know what to do. At least her house was a bit cleaner now, and she finally opened her curtains for the first time in forever. She blocked her eyes from the blinding sunlight with an audible yelp. She chuckled, remembering just how amazing the sun was. As a Jackson sped through the streets that were suddenly full of life, he noticed the glow of red and blue lights not too far behind. He swore and pushed all the way down on the gas. He was jolted backwards, and his car struggled to meet his demands. Even with the roaring wind, he could hear his car engine whining and smelt the rubber from his tires as they started to burn up. The car was going dangerously fast, over 100 miles per hour at this point. It felt like the car was going to fall apart at any moment, but he knew he was close. The red and blue lights slowly got further away. They were not going to risk their lives to catch up. He was still pressed back into his seat, eyes watering. He zoomed down the remaining streets, everything outside nothing more than a blur. He slowed down, knowing he was very close. His car came to a screeching halt, and he slammed his head on the leather steering wheel. He grinned as he stepped out of the car. Here he was, Robert's house, he thought to himself. He shook his face, trying to shake off the numbness he felt from driving so fast. His car was a mess, and he wasn't sure he was going to make it anywhere with that piece of junk anymore. He hurriedly made his way up the shaky wooden steps before reaching the door of the place that had caused it all. He kicked open the door, not giving Robert the courtesy of keeping his door nice and neat. He didn't deserve such kindness. The door shot open, and he ran in without a second thought, gun in hand. He stopped dead in his tracks as he heard the door slam behind him. He snapped his head around, but nobody was there. "Hello," Robert said, half hoping to not get a response. He looked forward again, and was taken aback by the sight of Robert just standing there. He snarled and said, as he lifted up his gun, "I've been waiting for you." Robert replied, a sick grin plastered on his face. Jackson ignored him and put his sweaty finger on the trigger, aiming at Robert's temple. Just then, Robert's skin started moving and writhing, as if something was inside of him, trying to break free. "What they?" Jackson said timidly, taking a step back. Robert's skin continued to move, until something finally broke the surface. It was a rotten, meaty hand. Jackson watched in horror and confusion, and something tore through Robert from the inside, crawling out of his skin. Jackson screamed, before turning around and running towards the door. Just then, the hand reached out and tried grabbing him, but missed and hit him instead. Now being shoved with so much force, Jackson was hurled forward, crashing through the door. He felt a sudden sharp pain from everywhere. His skin was now covered in pieces of jagged, bloody wood. He fell onto the hill with a thud, hitting his face on a large rock. His nose started bleeding, the dark red liquid flowing down his face. Before he could catch himself, he started tumbling down the hill, the wood digging deep into his skin, as if he was a fragile balloon on the verge of popping. Sharp, jagged rocks protruded from the hill, his skin being punctured, breaking bones, ribs, and making him bleed from every conceivable part of his bruised body. He let out a desperate, pained yell, before landing at the bottom of the hill with a loud thud. He groaned, attempting to push himself back up. He could barely move though, let alone breath. He took shallow, quick breaths, each one taking more and more effort than the last. He rolled over, vision blurred, to see the all-too-familiar red and blue lights that pulled up behind his car, screeching to a halt. He heard the car doors open and slam shut, and what he had believed to be Robert clambering down the hill with frightening speed, followed by the confused voices of 2 male officers, and the sudden jagged pain coming from his back. He was then swung up into the air, as he gasped. It felt like claws were digging into his back, and he let out a loud cry. His vision focused just in time to see himself all too clearly being slammed into the side of the hill again. He braced himself as he was slammed into the sharp, dry grass and the unforgiving, jagged rocks. He struggled with all his might, but his newfound adrenaline proved to be useless. He couldn't escape this thing's grasp. He whimpered faintly, before he frantically tried and failed to escape, his pulse coming to a stop, and his body finally giving in and going limp. Patrick stood there frozen as he watched whatever that creature is murder his coworker. Murder was an understatement. Tortured. No, not even that could describe what he had just seen. It slammed Robert into the hill, again and again, into a particularly sharp rock that had turned from a cool gray to a dark, ominous red. Once it was done playing with the lifeless corpse, it tried to twist and shake Jackson's body off its bloody claws, like a bug stuck to a windshield. It frowned before turning its attention to Patrick. Patrick stared into the face of death, and it stared right back. There seemed to be an understanding between the two. Patrick was going to die, and it was going to hurt. Patrick quickly reached for his gun, but before he could even unholster it, he was violently slammed onto the ground. He hadn't even seen it move. He glanced up, still recovering from the blow, just in time to see the cruiser speed away, his partner, heck, his only hope, leaving him with this demented thing. But he couldn't just die here. He quickly tried sitting up, but it suddenly felt like the weight of a truck landed on him. It was merely that thing's hand. But all Patrick could do was watch the pair of legs that were sliding down its throat. It swallowed, before snapping its head towards Patrick. Patrick felt an intense sense of dread, and scrambled to move. He couldn't though, its grip was too strong. He tried to scream, but there wasn't enough air in his lungs. That's when he knew it, he was going to die. Right now, it grinned, and with its now Jackson free hand, grabbed a hold of Patrick's left arm, and in one full swoop, it snapped his arm off like a twig. The sound of flesh ripping was too much for Patrick, and he attempted to scream again. But, of course, no noise escaped his lungs. Not even a single whimper. The thing, seemingly satisfied with the reaction of its victim, it wrapped its jaws around his head, hoisting him up into the air. It trotted around happily, now carrying the lifeless corpse of what was once Patrick. Proud of what it had accomplished, it quietly retreated into the woods. Whatever it was, it vanished after that, and the case was quickly swept under the rug. There were sightings of it here and there, but they've all been proven to just be either a cash grab or a cheap way to rise to fame. Everyone calls it by a different name. Some call it the Red Pines Monster. Others call it the Vessel, because of its shape-shifting abilities. You can call it whatever you want, though. But next time you decide to go camping, just promise me you won't go anywhere near Red Pines National Forest. Well, that's the story, Thompson said. And don't worry about it too much. It's just a tall tale designed to scare new officers like you off the job. Well, you folks go enjoy your day now. But I'm not sure if I believe that. Today the news aired something. 3 campers have gone missing at Red Pines National Forest, Temutha, Oregon. If you have any information, please contact the authorities. In 2020, I was working as a private investigator in rural Oregon. Most people make the stereotype that private detectives and investigators have walk-in clients, but that simply isn't true. I get almost all of my cases from clients by phone, and the call I got in that June was no exception. The client, a man named Jonathan Alexander, was calling about the disappearance of his father, Sergio Alexander. Jonathan's father had gone missing ever since a solo deer hunting trip in the backwoods of our little Oregon town, and the search parties and official parties hadn't turned up anything. In most cases like this, you're looking for a body in the woods, not a live person. But Jonathan was hopeful, so I gave him the benefit of the doubt. In this case, I took my go bag. A duffel bag and its contents were a bottle of water, a first aid kit, my Taurus Raging Hunter, a bag of Ziploc bags, my wallet and phone, and food. A Taurus Raging Hunter revolver might have been overkill, but I was planning to go into the woods. And the woods can be a dangerous place. This part of Oregon was stocked full of cougars, mountain lions, bay wolves, moose, and some others, and almost everyone carried a heavier firearm when going into the backwoods. The first place on my schedule was Jonathan's house, where I would meet him in person and have an interview. As I pulled up into his dirt driveway, I got a sense of the kind of person he was. His house was a 25-foot trailer stuck to the ground, with a backyard and patio facing the mountains. "Are you Jonathan?" I asked the man waiting for me. He was tall, at least 6'5", and wearing a checkered button-up, a trucker cap, and jeans. "Yeah," he replied. "You're Inspector Jacob, right? Come inside, I'll tell you the details. I also have some things that could help you depending on how willing you are." I walked inside the trailer, and the interior was everything I expected. The walls were lined with taxidermied bass and catfish, as well as several mounted deer heads and rifles propped up on display. A dirty kitchen with piles of dishes was one corner, and a small 2-person dinner table. "Jonathan," said John for short, and I sat down. Jonathan offered me a beer, but I declined. I never drank on a job. I started with the regular questions. Where was he last seen? Who was with him? What happened leading up to the night of the disappearance? John replied, telling the whole story. "My dad, Sergio, was a hunter and fisherman. Hunting and fishing was his life. He always had a rifle or a fishing rod. He's in his 60s and was in the military for 7 years, had a few tours in Afghanistan. On that night, he wanted to go solo buck hunting in the evening, so I dropped him off in a dirt road near his favorite spot. He didn't come back for 2 days. This was somewhat normal. He sometimes hunted overnight or just got lost. After a week passed, I got really worried. I could feel that something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut. I called the sheriff, and they organized a search party for 3 nights. We went in every direction, covered all the ground, and you know what? Not a single thing. Not a candy bar, no footsteps leading past his spot, no trail, nothing. After he was declared deceased, I went out myself to search. I know he's still out there, I know it." "And where is this dirt road?" John marked the road on the GPS on my phone, and I thanked him and left. I had a no-solve, no-pay rule, so I wouldn't get paid unless I actually found Sergio, dead or alive. My next stop was at the sheriff's office, in the middle of my small town. I drove past multiple roadside stores until I reached the parking lot of the sheriff's office. I parked and walked into the place, going up to the front desk where a tall and skinny deputy was doing paperwork and chewing gum, presumably as a substitute for cigarettes. I told him that I was looking into the disappearance of Sergio Alexander, and he sent me to the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a balding man in his 50s named Clyde, showed a forced smile as I walked inside. A stained American flag was pinned to the wall, along with dozens of missing person posters and wanted posters. "So, Inspector, is this missing guy a friend of yours?" he asked. "No," I replied. "A client wants me to find him. Sergio is the guy's dad." "Well, you're in luck," Clyde replied. "We haven't gotten much criminal activity, so I can show you some of the search party reports." Clyde reached into his desk and pulled out a stack of papers and photos, which I flicked through. One of the photos captured an image showing a trail of footprints ending abruptly. "And what is this?" I asked. "It's the strangest part of the case. The footprints leading to Sergio's favorite hunting spot just stopped. No trail leading somewhere else, no tire tracks, no ATV tracks, nothing. It's like he just up and vanished into thin air." But I sighed. This case was going to be a hard one. "What else of interest was there?" I asked, looking through the files. Clyde pulled out a satellite image of the woods, with a Sharpie written on the spot where Sergio had gone missing. "This is the entire area in which we estimate that Sergio could have walked around in the time he was gone," Clyde stated. "We checked every bit of it, and guess what? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. But there was one thing we found of interest." "Which is?" I asked. "There was a pattern. Every time we checked a place, we heard Sergio's radio coming from somewhere." I raised an eyebrow. Sheriff Clyde continued, "But it was very, very faint. Could barely hear it. And another strange thing was when we went to search for Sergio. In the entire area where he went missing, all the birds and animals were quiet, even the crickets. As soon as we left the area of the supposed disappearance, the sound all came back." I checked the watch. It was early evening. After jotting down all the notes I could gather, I thanked the sheriff and left. My next stop, the woods. By the time I pulled up to the dirt road in my pickup truck, it was well into getting dark. This wasn't the ideal time for me to search through the area and find clues. Every detective knows how important the first 45 hours are. The place was exactly as John had described it. It was extremely rural, just a few miles away from a mountain range, and it was completely silent. The forest should have been alive, with birds chirping, wild turkeys moving about, crickets chirping, but the night was dead. Turning on my headlamp, I found Sergio's footsteps from when he was last seen and started combing through the area. Just like Clyde and Jonathan had said, the trail abruptly stopped in the middle of the woods. Nothing. No other signs that Sergio was even there. It was as if he just up and vanished. Suddenly, I heard some rustling behind me. It was fully dark by now, and nobody should have been there beside me. The sound came again, except it was now in front of me, but just out of the reach of my headlamp. "Who's there?" I yelled. "Show yourself. I'm armed." For dramatization, I flicked the revolver holster for my Taurus on my belt. Suddenly, something tapped me right on the back. I didn't have time to pull out my gun. And considering that whoever was doing this was probably some drunk guy, I wouldn't need it. I turned and threw a Mike Tyson haymaker in the thing's direction and ended up hitting a tree and nearly breaking my wrist. In the split second that I was proud of my Mike Tyson haymaker, I realized that I had punched a tree and that my knuckles were actually bleeding. Whoever was behind me, if there was someone behind me, they were long gone. And that was when the laughing started. Actually, it was more like cackling. Weird, crazy, and unnatural cackling. Whatever you'd call it. It was unsettling anyway. I pulled out my revolver designed to drop bears and fired a deafening shot into the air. The laughing, everything, stopped for a bit, and I almost put my guard down. Then I heard something whisper, just an inch away from my ear. It said, "Ella EAVTASPSLE." And the next thing I know, I hear the sound of a million running footsteps catching up to me, and I GTFO. I ran right out of the woods, fast enough to outrun Usain Bolt. Adrenaline is one heck of a drug. I jumped in my pickup truck, turned the engine, and peeled out of there. All in record time. Whatever was behind me was still chasing me behind the car. I looked into the rearview mirror to try to look at the thing, which was running at least 80 miles per hour to keep up with me, and I saw nothing. Well, it wasn't a conceptual nothing. It was nothing in the sense that it was nothing my brain could comprehend and understand. There was a huge blurry shape running after me, dark as the night, and fuzzy around the edges. It was as if somebody took a huge mass of static from an 80s TV, made it into some sort of creature, and put it on a dirt road at 9 o'clock to chase some poor private investigator. I turned the road, drove down the road until I reached the town. The thing was obviously gone. I parked at a gas station parking lot and threw up once my body realized how much running I had done. The next day, I headed to a woman named Meredith's house. I had heard about her from when I was at the bar the night I saw the demon thing by some paranormal junkies who were particularly interested in what I said. Meredith apparently owned a tea and plant shop at the edge of town, having the shop based on the first floor of her house. She also knew a thing or two about paranormal entities, the occult, monsters, ghouls, and well, you get the gist. I pulled up into the driveway of her shop and knocked on the door. "We're closed, asshole." "Somebody," probably Meredith yelled. I looked at the store hours taped on the front door. Today was a Friday, and according to her probably outdated store hours chart, she was, as a matter of fact, open. "You're open, so stop being lazy." I yelled right back. Meredith groaned and opened the triple, locked door. In person, she was a short Latina woman with long black hair and a purple beanie and wearing a trench coat and jeans, which was totally not suspicious. "What do you want?" she snapped. "What I want is to know what is in those woods. And lady, don't piss me off, I'm still on a hangover. You study the paranormal and supernatural, or am I wrong?" "No, you're not wrong. Good. Because yesterday, I got bullied and chased by some weird demon thing while looking for a missing man in his 60s. Meredith's face went pale. I taught myself how to learn and read expressions people make, and by the looks of it, she knew exactly what I was talking about. "Come in. I might be able to help you." Like Jonathan's house, I was easily able to tell the interior of the house from the inside. There were plants everywhere, on the walls, growing in giant pots on the floor, as well as shelves stocked full of beakers and test tubes, and a few bags full of strange substances. I sat down on a worn-out couch while Meredith assessed my situation. "First of all, who told you about me?" she asked. "Some British fellow named Ron," I said. But then again, I was drunk, so he might have been a John or Bob. "How did you say this thing looked like?" "Big. Dark. Blurry. I couldn't actually see it since it was at least 100 feet away, but it was running 80 miles per hour, whatever it was. Huge, must have been over 20 feet big." "Did you look at it directly?" Meredith asked. I answered plainly, "No. I looked at it through the rearview mirror, and even then I couldn't see it well." "Must be why you're alive." "What was that?" I asked. "What you just described is what we in the business call nagalacuous." "Nagalacuous," I muttered. "The heck is that?" "No one really knows," Meredith replied. "He, she, whatever Nagalacu is ancient, has been in these woods for probably over a century, and no one knows where he came from. You said that you were looking for a missing guy, right? Well, Nagalacu probably took him. Nagalacu might eat him, might let him go, might keep him for eternity. I don't know." "Then how do I kill this thing?" I asked. "I need to close this case." "You probably can't," Meredith said. "But whatever you do, don't look directly at Nagalacu, or your mind will literally melt at the unfathomable horror, and you will die. Do not look at it." "Don't look at the demon thing," I said. "Gotcha. Do you have, any herbs or materials that will stop Nagalak from hurting me or doing anything?" "Wes, actually I do. It's white ash blessed by a shaman. If you sprinkle it over yourself, or any weapons you have, it should be more effective against any supernatural being." Meredith stood up and walked towards a cabinet, and pulled out a large Ziploc bag of white ash, which seemed to glow and vibrate, and she handed it to me. "This ain't free," she said. "It's $100. I sighed and reached into my wallet and pulled out $100 in cash and handed it to Meredith in exchange for the white ash. Meredith called out as I packed up my stuff and headed for the door. Yeah. Be careful, Ba." Like that was even possible. I got out of there and drove to the gas station, where I planned to get my supplies to hunt Nagalacu and find Sergio Alexander. But before that, I needed to fuel up. I bought incendiary rounds for my revolver that the gas station surprisingly sold, and I ordered pineapple pizza while listening to Piano Man by Billy Joel. After I finished up and threw out my garbage, I had devised a plan, which involved flares, a bottle of vodka, a huge jug filled with gasoline, and a Molotov cocktail. The cashier, a guy named John, seemed very interested in the thing I bought from the gas station. He was a tall guy in his 50s, with a graying beard, a trucker cap, and a military attitude. "What are all these things for?" he asked, as I heaved the heavy gasoline tank onto the counter, along with some other flammable and extremely dangerous things. "Oh, nothing," I answered, trying not to sound suspicious. "Just trying to take care of a pest problem." But John didn't see that as nothing. "You're going into the woods, ain't ya?" I was caught off guard at how easily and accurately he knew what I was doing. "Yes," I replied. "Well, I'm off work after this shift, so I'll come with you. Or, I could just report to the police that a private investigator is buying suspicious amounts of flammables and gasoline, along with 45 Magnum incendiary rounds for a Taurus Raging Hunter revolver." "You Army?" I asked. "Yeah," he replied. "Been in the U.S. Marines and the Navy for a couple of years, had 5 tours in Afghanistan." I didn't see any reason why John shouldn't come with me, and besides, I could use his military and combat skills, which might be useful, and I wasn't going to carry a 55-gallon tank full of gasoline in the middle of the woods alone. "Fine," I said. "Let's do this." A few hours later, just as the sun was setting, John and I got out of my pickup truck in front of the woods. John had brought his trusty Hellhump gauge, packed with Dragon's Breath incendiary rounds, and a mini flamethrower. John would be my backup and, at the bait, while I carried the gasoline tank duct, taped to an explosive Molotov cocktail. The plan was, we would go to the woods, to the spot where I had last been attacked by Saguth, and wait. Once we heard a sign of him, we would both put on our blindfolds, to avoid having our souls sucked out by the unfathomable sight of the eldritch cosmic horror. "Ready?" John asked. "Yeah," I said. "Just don't shoot me while you have your blindfold on." We walked into the woods in silence, and after a mile or so, I reached the spot where Sergio was last seen. We sat there and waited an hour or so until all the noise suddenly stopped, and I heard the sound of something massive dragging across the forest floor. "Put on your blindfold," I said, putting on mine. "We can't risk seeing this thing." John nodded, grinned, and put the blindfold on. Whatever it was sounded massive. It said in a demonic and ancient voice, "Lev teach SPLACE." John and I fired a shot into the direction of the voice, and although my bullet missed by a mile, the old man's shot was a direct hit. Although I couldn't hear it, I saw the light from the blast of fire sparks and flames coming from the barrel of John's shotgun, and it hit the demon monster. The thing screeched, and we moved back a few steps, still blind, and without warning the ground opened beneath us. "What the fuck?" John and I fell into the cavern beneath us, 6 feet. "You okay?" I asked. "Never been better," John replied. "What is this place?" I lifted my blindfold and looked around to see that we had fallen into a subterranean tunnel that led deeper into the earth. "Ananyan Tyra. Fitziina Gielp," a voice screamed, presumably Sergio's based on the circumstances. We ran down the tunnel and searched for Sergio, and we found the man, lying on the cave floor with a broken leg. "We're gonna get you out of here," I said. I heard a screech come from the entrance to the tunnel, as Nagalaku crawled down, breaking the walls. I reached down and picked up the tank of gasoline, had my eyes closed, and waited until Nagalaku was just close enough, my heart beating. "GTO. I lit the Molotov, yelled at John to take cover, just as Nagalaku got within a dozen meters in our range. I had previously sprinkled the white ash Meredith had given me on the gasoline tank for extra effectiveness, and so that could kill Nagalaku if the explosion didn't. Nagalaku was only a few meters away from us. I lit the gasoline bomb and threw it, and as it exploded, I grinned. "Gotcha, asshole." So the funny thing is, a group of redneck hunters found us later. They had apparently found the hole in the explosion crater and investigated. John and I had suffered some mild burns from the enormous gasoline explosion, but the missing guy, Sergio, came out harmless besides the broken leg he already had before. The redneck family dragged us all the way to their pickup truck, then drove us to the hospital, where we both got treated for our injuries. Sergio was found and reunited after a long disappearance, and Jonathan paid me in the thousands, with the money I didn't expect him to have. When I went back to the place where Sergio had disappeared, and where I had blown Nagalaku high to the sky, I found a very strange, giant, half-human skeleton, where I remembered Nagalaku getting blown up. Sergio Alexander was found, and I had killed one of the things that went bump in the night. Case closed. Don't fuck with the woods, kids.